Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode 1 of the Ponderosa Podcast. My name is Glenn Plunkett. My guest today is Jesse Deubel, and he's the director of the New Mexico Wildlife Federation. In our discussion, we covered a wide range of topics, from culinary tours of Eastern Europe to wildlife conservation, Jesse's upbringing and career, and his journey to becoming the director of the New Mexico Wildlife Federation. We also explored what the word Zen means to both of us. How about we get right into it?
Slovakia, it was based on how many windows are on the front of the house. So you'd have only one window and then all of these false windows to make it look like, balanced.
Yeah.
But it's like, we only put one window on the front of the house because then we have less taxes.
There's a town in Canada that if you go there, all the front doors are like off the ground and there's no stairs. And it had to do with the taxes because putting the front staircase is like the last piece that made it a complete house. And as long as you didn't put that on, you just go in and out the back door. It's like you never had to
pay taxes.
Or pay the full. I don't know what the deal was,
some kind of a assessment.
Maybe it was like the house finishing.
Like an impact fee.
I don't know what it was, but there's a whole town in Canada that's like that. So.
That's pretty cool.
I saw a picture of it and I was like, I wonder if that's because when it snows, but no, it's just taxes. It's to get around the money thing.
Geez, that's interesting. So. A lot of places in Europe too, they would base property taxes on how many closets. Well, they would base it on how many bedrooms, but it wasn't considered a bedroom if it didn't have a closet. Oh. And so all the bedrooms don't have closets, so they don't have to pay taxes, but they have these armoires, like they have furniture as closets.
That's so funny.
Here you don't see that much furniture, like closets, right? Like an armoire we just have walk-in closets and stuff.
Yeah. A lot of the old houses, like from the turn of the last century and stuff, you see that more. Like they just won't have closets.
So I think it was probably
because people brought their armoires from Europe with them. They're like, I don't need a closet. I've got this thing, whatever it is.
Right.
So I want to talk about what you're doing now.
Okay.
And I want to talk about Zen. We've got to discuss that a little bit.
Cool. Yeah, for sure.
Before all that, you just touched on you were in Eastern Europe, and so I'm trying to get a hold of you, and you're like, where were you? Croatia or something?
Yeah, I might have been in Slovakia.
Slovakia. Yeah, you're like, I'm in Slovakia.
I think I was in the Czech Republic when.
Let me get back to you next week, and I was like, I had no idea they left the country.
I was doing a political history tour, really, really heavy stuff, actually, going to concentration camps, meeting with Ukrainian refugees who are currently in Slovakia, meeting with school teachers, students, learning the public education system, meeting with healthcare providers, learning their healthcare systems, just to get a broader understanding of that culture and the systems that exist in that part of the world, because they're so different than here, and learning about all the things that we take for granted here. I met one guy from Romania, and his grandfather was born in Yugoslavia, which doesn't exist anymore.
Right.
But he died in the same home he was born in. He was born in this rock hut, and he died at 85 years old in the same rock hut in which he was born. But during his 85 years of life, he was a citizen of 5 different countries.
Yeah.
Which is for me,
the Balkans, there's a lot of changing of hands, and different people come in and decide it's theirs. I had a friend. We worked at the tree farm together, and he was from Bosnia, and that was his first job coming over from. He had been in Germany a couple of years because that's where they had all fled during the Civil War, and then. Eventually, Germany was like, "We got to go somewhere else," and so they got sponsored into the U.S. by the Greek Orthodox Church here in Albuquerque, and
wow.
And then they helped find him a job, which was trees of grouse, him and a couple other guys, and the other guys kind of left, and they ended up going to work at a car rental place at the airport because it was full of old Yugoslavian people, so they all talked the same language. But he stayed because he's like, I don't want to just be around people who speak my language. I don't need to learn the language here.
Yeah.
So it's pretty cool.
Yeah, what else was surprising is how prevalent English is.
Oh, yeah.
In all those countries. It'd been years since, it was in the late 90s last time I was in Europe. And at that time, France wasn't in the European Union. Right. They weren't using the EU currency. Yeah. But at that time, there was you couldn't hardly find anybody that spoke English then.
French people, a lot of them understand it, they just refuse to speak it. I experienced that.
Yeah.
Because I worked in a youth hostel here in Albuquerque a long time ago.
Oh,
One of my
okay.
many, one of my many blue collar jobs or entry level jobs, and so I got to meet people from all over the world, and the French people, like, they just did not want to speak English. And it's just funny.
You know,
not all of them, but some of them.
Yeah, I don't necessarily blame them, you know, because it does feel like a little bit of a loss of their culture. When you're in Europe and all the billboards are American actors, the movies are playing American movies, the music the kids are listening to is all this American music.
Yeah.
Everybody's speaking English. It's like, man, I could totally respect some frustration and feeling like you're losing sense of the culture.
Well, and the French have a branch of the government that's strictly to preserve French, the language. And so like a lot of new technologies and stuff, they won't make a new French word for it. They just use the English word. So like weekend is le weekend.
Oh,
they just refuse to francify the word. They're just like, nope, we're not adding that. we'll use your word.
Wow, that's interesting.
Yeah. So you went to old Yugoslavia?
Well, actually, I started in the Czech Republic. This was on a river cruise, so we went down the Danube River. Oh, wow. But we were stopping in villages and towns and having immersive experiences in each of these different places. So it started in Prague. We were originally supposed to fly into Frankfurt, Germany, and then from there to Prague, but the German airline workers were all on strike. And luckily, we were able to make last-minute changes to our reservation because we were going to fly into Germany and then we were going to get stuck there because there were no flights leaving.
Oh, man.
So we were able to get on a different plane that was headed to Belgium, and so we flew into Brussels.
Oh, wow.
And then from Brussels to Prague, I think we spent 4 days in Prague, and then went to Český Krumlov, which is another smaller village in the Czech Republic, and then from there we went to Linz, which is in Austria, and then spent time in Austria and went to Vienna and different places, and then from there into Slovakia, and experienced some amazing places in Slovakia. You know, Bratislava was an unbelievable place, and anyway, just really learned a lot about that culture. And then after we left Slovakia, we went to Budapest.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so we went to Hungary, and man, it was fascinating. I mean, really unbelievable.
Everything's real compact in Europe.
Yeah,
and I haven't traveled around a lot, but I know, like, we were in Germany. I think we were coming back from Afghanistan. We were in Germany, and we had some time to kill because our plane broke, because the Air Force planes always break in Germany. Shockingly, like where the good beer is. Like I think they just turn off the radio. They're like, oh, you're gonna need a couple days. And so we just rented a car and drove to some towns in Germany, and then drove to Luxembourg, and then drove through France and back into Germany, like all in one day.
Yeah,
It's just like...
Yeah, it's interesting to get around there. And now with the European Union, you don't even have to show travel documents like a passport.
No, you just drive right through
one country to the next. It was super convenient. Most places are taking the EU, the euro, for currency, so you don't have to change your currency all the time. And
that makes it a lot easier.
It was super easy to navigate around and travel from place to place, and it was so eye-opening, though, the different experiences and the different cultures from one place to another. So sure, they're super close in proximity,
super different,
but different cuisines, different traditions, different dances, different songs, all those kinds of things. So it was pretty great.
It's so old too. Like,
oh man,
the churches in Germany is like, these things are like older than anything in the U.S.
You know where my brain went while I was on this trip is we're touring medieval castles and all, where they used to have moats with alligators and all the different kind of things. But we're on streets that are 700 years old and going up into towers and bridges 700 years old. And I'm thinking back to the United States, particularly the Southwest United States where we are here. And the oldest continuously occupied building in North America is Taos Pueblo. Right?
Yeah.
And I'm thinking about the parallel existence of people in Europe 700 years ago and the type of architecture and the way life was in Europe 700 years ago compared to the way life was in New Mexico for our indigenous populations 700 years
I'm
ago.
going to hazard a guess that it was better here. just from what I've heard about the Middle Ages, like, doesn't seem...
Yeah, they actually have museums where you could tour like the torture implements that they use on people, you know, the guillotine and those kinds of things. But yeah, it was very eye-opening for sure.
So why did you do this? Like, what? Like, is this?
This came up as a super kind of last-minute thing. So my girlfriend is a chef, right? She's I like to say she's a wild game chef because that is one of the things she does specialize in is wild game, but that's not all she does. Yeah. But she runs food tours. So she which I'd never been on one, but they're super. I mean, until I met her, I'd never been on a food tour, but it's a great way to learn a new place. So like recently I was in Savannah, Georgia. I had to go there for work, and Aaron met me there so we could spend some time together. And the first thing she did is booked a food tour.
That's so awesome.
So I'm going to book a food tour of Savannah. Yeah. So the guide will take us from restaurant to restaurant to restaurant, introducing us to the local cuisine and talking about it. But along the way, it's a walking tour. So you're learning about all the buildings and exactly the art and the cemeteries and all of the neat stuff. So that after one food tour in a new city, like you have this thorough understanding of this place where you are.
Well, the food is so tied to the history and the culture.
It really is.
You know, that's
everywhere.
Yeah, like I can totally see how that would be a very comprehensive education just in learning about the food. Like,
it was
that's cool.
It was really impactful. But anyway, so she runs Ozark Culinary Food Tours, which is based out of Bella Vista, Arkansas, and she does food tours in all the downtown areas like Bentonville, Fayetteville, Rogers, Siloam Springs. But she's been working to expand her business to include global travel, to do tours. She's leaving, I don't know, a month or so. She's doing a tour she's calling the Taste of Italy. And they're basically tasting their way through Italy and doing wine pairings and going to the wineries, learning how to make the wine, going to the vineyards about how all the grapes are grown. It's like a very in-depth culinary experience. So you're going into...
That's so cool.
Which is similar to what we did on this trip. Like, it wasn't... I mean, we went to some touristy places and saw the touristy spots, but we're eating dinners in families' homes, like local families, and having conversations about how they live and what day-to-day life is like, and learning the economics of it. How much is the rent or the mortgage payment on this building? Where do you work? How much do you make? How does it compare to the way that we live in America? So much different than just going like on a touristy thing. But she's been working on expanding her travel business to include every destination on the globe, like even Antarctica and everywhere. And so she wanted to do this trip in Eastern Europe as kind of like a
test bed, or
a test. You know, let's run this thing as a test and see how this will work. And so she just called me up and invited me with very short notice. She called me up and says, "Hey, I'm going to do this thing in Europe. Would you like to come with me? I'd love for you to come and experience it and provide me feedback, tell me what you think of it, and just kind of be like a secret shopper almost."
That's fantastic.
So I was like, well, I don't know, because it's like 3 weeks and that's a long time to be away. So let me talk to my boss. You know, I have a job. So I called my board president and ran it by him, the idea of it. And I said, there's some meetings I just can't miss, but now that we can work remotely in a lot of cases with Zoom and stuff, and the time difference is such that I could experience the whole day in Europe and then work in the nighttime, basically. I mean, I
did an 8 a.m. meeting here.
I did a live radio interview with Richard Eads, who runs a radio show out of Santa Fe on the BLM oil and gas rule. And I think it was midnight when I was on the live radio when it was like, 2 or 3 in the afternoon in New Mexico. So I was able to still work remotely.
Just skip the sleep part.
Much of the time, just sleep when you're dead, right?
There you go.
So there was a little sleep deprivation
maybe
at times.
A lot of caffeine and just press on.
Well, there's no shortage of coffee in Eastern Europe, I can assure you of that.
Strong.
Some amazing coffee.
And it's all in little cups.
Especially in Vienna, man. Vienna was, the coffee in Vienna was really spectacular. But all of the things, I mean, going through the Danube River and through these beautiful lush valleys where they're growing apricots, huge apricot orchards, and all the trees were in blossom. But looking at the vineyards and the way that they've terraced the mountains to build these vineyards for the grapes, and the way that they're working these fields, and And of course, as an avid hunter, I had to talk to all of the locals about how
I was going to ask if you did any.
I didn't do any hunting, but
if you'd like touch base.
Oh, absolutely! I'm learning about the rules,
so cool.
the systems, the way that wildlife is managed.
I bet it's so different there.
It's supposed to be, but in New Mexico, as you know, I feel like we privatize our wildlife in violation of the North American model of wildlife conservation much more than we should. But generally speaking, North America's system of wildlife management is drastically different than it is in Europe. One of the things that's interesting in Europe is they've eradicated all of the native predators in most places. Like you can find grizzly bears in Slovakia in some places, but there's a lot of feral hogs. It's a big deal. They have a lot of deer, but they don't have anything that preys on those deer.
So the deer
the populations just blow up. The populations of hogs and deer blow up, and that creates a lot of problems for their agricultural producers. Not very different than what we do in the United States. I mean, our agricultural producers are challenged by elk and deer and things also, but we have native predators on the landscape to help manage populations of the prey animals. There, they've eradicated all the predators. So when a hunter, it seemed like hunting was most accessible to the wealthier class of people. It's not something that...
Well, that's like the historical model, right?
That's
like
right.
They were the only ones allowed to take meat.
It's like the king's deer.
Right.
The deer belong to the people whose land on which the animal exists, which is very different than here. Where, you're on this beautiful mountain property. When a black bear walks onto your property,
he's
not
mine.
your black bear. It belongs equally to all of the people. So it's a different system in that regard. But when their wealthy class leases a piece of ground to hunt, they're given a minimum number of animals that must be taken. And if they don't hit those quotas, they are penalized. There's financial penalties for not killing enough game. And it's interesting too, because our North American model of wildlife conservation in this country doesn't allow for the commercialization of wildlife. Back at the turn of the century when we were eradicating buffalo and everything was being killed and sold for furs and sold for meat, it was that commercialization that led to near extinction of almost every species of wildlife on this continent. And so when we adopted the North American model of wildlife conservation, one of the 7 tenets, a really important one, is that wildlife shall not be commercialized. So you can't buy game meat. I mean, you could see Arby's advertise a venison sandwich, but that's coming from an agriculturally produced farm, typically in New Zealand. New Zealand is where most wild game that you buy in this country mostly comes from New Zealand. But it's not legal for me to take a deer or an elk and sell any of that meat to anybody, regardless of price. It's just
that's just like a fail-safe to keep it from getting out of control.
To keep people from essentially commodifying, I guess maybe that's the right word, commodifying our wildlife resources and using it to become a financial vehicle to drive personal income.
Because that never goes sideways when we use natural resources for money. Like that never goes wrong.
Exactly. Good
that
point.
Always works out great.
Yeah, so it's really neat because in this country, we can harvest wildlife and I can give it to you. I can gift it to you. There's no problem there. Fill out a donation certificate so that Fish and Game has a record, because if you didn't have a hunting license but you have this elk roast in your freezer, it's sometimes nice to be able to show this is how I got it. It was legally harvested. But it's an interesting thing there, because when they're killing deer, again, they have a quota, the minimum quota, which is opposite of here. We have a maximum. So if I was to draw an elk tag, it would allow me to kill 1 elk. That's the maximum. Their regulations are based on minimums rather than maximums. So it's a floor, not a ceiling. But the number's so great that no individual hunter is going to be able to utilize all of that meat. So what they typically do is a hunter harvests an animal and then takes it down, and they have these refrigerators or freezers that the hunter just puts all of his information on a tag on the skinned and cleaned carcass, and then hangs the tag in one of these freezers, these meat lockers, like a public meat locker. Then a health inspector does daily inspection. So every morning the health inspector comes by, inspects all the carcasses to make sure that they've been properly cleaned and taken care of. Assuming they all pass his inspection, then he puts a second tag on there showing that it's passed inspection. So then the next person that comes to the meat locker are the purchasers. So they either own a meat market in the village or they own a restaurant. It might be a chef. They'll come in and they'll pick the carcass. They'll take the animals that they want out of the freezer, and then they essentially just Venmo the money to the hunter who has his tag on the
Okay, so
carcass.
it does circle back to...
So the hunter ends up getting compensated. So he puts it in there, but the hunter and the reseller never actually interact.
Right,
personally.
yeah, that's
He just
so
hangs it
interesting.
up in
it's like a dead drop.
Exactly. He hangs it up in the closet,
Yeah.
and money comes into his account for the animals that are taken out of the meat locker. So it's very commercial, but it's just interesting because here there's a lot of controversy always about having predators on the landscape, particularly ones that had been at one point extirpated, like Mexican gray wolves.
Yep. Yeah.
At one point in history in the early 90s, we were on this planet, we were down to 7 Mexican gray wolves in existence.
Oh my gosh.
Period. 7. And so U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service captured those 7 and started a breeding program to try to keep the population from going into extinction, from blinking out. And now at the last count, which occurred just this past February, in New Mexico and Arizona, we have 241 wild Mexican gray wolves. And I've worked on the studies, and I've worked on the wolf count and all of the things. We tranquilize them via helicopter and put radio or GPS collars on them, measure their teeth, measure their body weight, check their length, go over all of their health stuff with a qualified veterinarian. But the Mexican Wolf Recovery Program is extremely controversial.
No, I've heard a lot. Yeah, I hear a lot of pushback from
Yeah.
ranchers and...
Yeah, ranchers are concerned, that the
And
wolves
then a lot of the public who just feel like they have to have an opinion on stuff. Like, whoa, we don't need wolves here. It's like, bro, you live in a suburb. Like, the wolf probably isn't going to come to you.
Right, yeah. It's interesting, because I work for the New Mexico Wildlife Federation. So our mission statement is very much based on public lands and the wildlife that those public lands support. And we're full supporters of native wildlife. I mean, it's a native species that existed. The idea that as humans that we would be comfortable causing another species to go extinct is troublesome.
The hubris, yeah.
Right? It's just...
I want to circle back around to that.
Yeah, okay.
I want to check the camera real quick and make sure it's working, and then I want to talk a little bit about where you came from, how Jesse,
cool.
and how we got to here.
Yeah, sounds
good.
good.
May or may
man.
not edit this part out. So.
Yeah, I'll follow your lead, Glenn.
So the camera's running. It made its first cycle with the intervalometer, which is good because basically what that little device does is the camera shuts itself off after 20 minutes, and the intervalometer 4 seconds later turns it back on. Wow. It basically trips the shutter, essentially, and that's how you can do. It'll be 20-minute clips, but I can do hours and hours of video. I've got a 1 terabyte card in that thing, so
that's awesome. That is super cool.
So we'll see how it all works out, but it's working. Everything's running, so that's good. I wanted to, one of the things I want to do with anybody is learn about them too.
Sure.
And I could listen to you talk about this other stuff all day, and we're going to circle back to a lot of that. But I want to hear about Jesse. And
cool.
I was reading your bio. You grew up in Espanola.
Yeah. Well, my early years. So I was born in New Mexico. I'm one of the. I don't know if it's one of the few. That might be an exaggeration, but we have a lot of people here from other places, which is great.
I was born in Santa Fe.
Oh, really? I thought you were from Oregon.
No, right? My wife's from Oregon, but I'm an actual New Mexican native.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So fist bump to that, you and me both.
There's not many of us.
No, it feels like there's not. But yeah, when I was born, I was actually born in Albuquerque, but we lived at the time in La Puebla, which is a little suburb of Espanola, essentially.
I think I just drove through it on the way to Taos the other day.
Oh, okay. Awesome. Yeah, it's some famous stuff right around there. Rancho de Chimayo, for example, is right there. The Santuario, that a lot of people are making the pilgrimage around Easter time, and so it's a fantastic place, fairly rural community though. And at the time when I was born, my dad worked for the city of Santa Fe. He worked in their wastewater treatment plant. He was a chemist. His degree was from New Mexico Tech in Socorro. That's where my dad graduated college, and he had a degree in chemistry. And so he was working at the wastewater treatment plant in Santa Fe. And even way back then, I was born in 1980. So way back then in the 80s, Santa Fe was expensive to live in. And someone, a single income family with that income coming from the city of Santa Fe didn't have the financial ability to own a home in Santa Fe. Like it just wasn't possible. It was challenging to own a home anywhere. So we actually lived in a property that belonged to a family member, a old adobe building.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and it was kind of falling apart, and the adobes were exposed.
Because the stucco's gone and it's not your road.
Yeah. And I have, I was young, so I don't have great recollection of all of the details of the building, but it was kind of falling apart. And but it was in a rural area. It was, we had quite a bit of land. I think that house was on 42 acres.
Oh, wow.
And just like you are here, it was right up against a bunch of national forest. Yeah. And we generally the house would have been on propane, but we generally didn't have any propane in the tank. So that was empty. So we had a wood stove. And that wood stove, was fueled with firewood. My dad would gather on public lands.
Sure,
cutting firewood has always been, and it's in my blood too. I mean, I love it. Like, gathering firewood is a very important thing to me, and it was to my dad. So we would burn wood from public lands to heat the home, and then my mom would use that wood stove as her primary cooking vessel. My mom's an amazing cook, but she's cooking the wild game that my dad would get off of those public lands.
That's so cool.
Yeah, I mean, we lived in a situation where, we didn't have a lot of financial resources, but it was a very, very rich upbringing. I mean, I was 6 years old and I had a BB gun and 42 acres. Like, that's heaven. I don't know. I mean, I can't imagine a better childhood,
That's fantastic.
Regardless of what the financial situation was, it didn't matter, And it wasn't until, going back to my earlier, so I grew up there until I was like 8 years old.
Okay.
And then crime had gotten real bad. Rio Arriba County was, I don't know how it is now, but in those days it was kind of a rough place to live.
Espanola looks rough when you drive through it now. I don't know how it is.
It was, I mean, at the time, and this is unfortunate to say, but at the time it was the heroin capital of the world.
Oh, I didn't know that.
There was a lot of drugs, just a lot of crime. We only had one vehicle. My dad had an old 1978 Ford pickup truck, two-wheel drive Ford pickup that we used to get stuck every time we took it out. But, when he was at work, my mom and my brother and my sister and I are all at home. Yeah. And the single mom, or not single, obviously my dad was at work, but at that moment
just
in time, she's
kids.
just at home with 3 kids, and you got all of the drugs and crime and all of the things. So the house had been broken into a number of times and, robbed and those kinds of things. And so there was a lot of safety concerns. And so about that time in the late 80s, MREP was coming into Rio Rancho and building all kinds of super affordable houses in preparation for the Intel plant expanding. And Intel was growing and building new fabs, and they're making processor chips and all this stuff. And so MREP came in and was selling these homes starting like the $50,000 range, right, in the late 80s. And that was an amount of money that my parents could afford to own a home, get a mortgage, and they could afford a payment on a $50,000 or $60,000 loan, whatever it would have been. And so at that point, we moved to Rio Rancho.
Okay.
And that was a huge shock for me as a kid, because we went from living in this very rural setting, this rural environment, to living on
just like the worst example of suburbia.
Exactly, like, a 50 by 150 foot lot, 1,600 square foot.
Houses.
Exactly, houses 5 feet from each other, or 5 foot easements, so 10 feet, every 10 feet is another house. So it was a big shock to the system.
that must have been.
Never lived on a paved road. There were certain things I can remember as a kid thinking how cool it was I could ride my bicycle on pavement. That was kind of neat. And then skateboarding, I'm like, I could get a skateboard, which I did, and I broke my right arm twice and my left arm once. So never was a very good skateboarder.
Go big or go home, right?
Yeah, exactly. So, but it was a big shock. Luckily, the Bosque was nearby. I mean, from my house in River's Edge, which is where we moved.
Okay.
My dad continued to commute to Santa Fe. He later left the wastewater treatment plant and went to work for the state engineer's office and water rights and stuff. But he commuted. There were no schools in Rio Rancho. People who are listening to this, who are familiar with Rio Rancho now, might find it interesting that I grew up in River's Edge, which is almost in Bernalillo. I mean, It's on Highway 528 or the Pat D'Arco Highway, almost to Bernalillo, Highway 550. But I went to Cibola High School. Okay. The closest school to me was Cibola.
Yeah.
The kids 2 streets north of the street where I grew up on, they went to Del Norte High School. Oh my God. Yeah, they were bused to Del Norte. And then the kids who lived south of me went to Jemez Pueblo High School. So they actually went to school on the Pueblo.
Okay.
So there were no schools. Intel later built a number of schools to take
And now
care
that's
of
a
all
huge
these
driving
kids.
force of people living in Rio Rancho is the good schools.
Exactly. Now it's, Rio Rancho has this awesome education system.
But you had none.
I did not have that at all.
Wow.
So I think when I started as a freshman at Cibola High School, I think our freshman class was 1,160 students. So it was a huge, you had all of their regular district, and now they're getting all these Rio Rancho kids. And Rio Rancho was like the fastest growing city in the country at that time. And so there were 40, 45 students per classroom. It was
those poor teachers.
Yeah, it was really an interesting time. But that's kind of how I ended up in the Albuquerque area. Okay. So I grew up in Rio Rancho, and then I've actually left twice. So after high school, I went to work at MCI WorldCom, which was a big call center.
I remember the cards.
Yeah. Yeah. So I was working there and had a great career. I was going to UNM for college, which was super cool. Then my career started to get in the way, so I left UNM and went to the University of Phoenix, which was kind of like more of an online school. We met in the evenings twice a week, I think. But I had a great career at MCI, and then they got shut down. I don't know if you remember. I can't remember what year this would have been, but there was a big Enron scandal. Do you remember when the big Enron scandal happened?
I do, yeah.
Well,
and that was tied to MCI WorldCom?
Well, it was a completely separate scandal, but what happened was Arthur Andersen had been the accounting firm that was doing all the accounting for Enron and had been cooking their books.
Okay.
So when the Securities Exchange Commission did an investigation, they said, well, we need to look into other companies that Arthur Andersen is doing the accounting for.
Yeah, right.
And they looked into WorldCom and found out that those books were also completely cooked. I showed up to work one day and there was chains around the door, and there's a big sign.
That's like Hollywood stuff.
Yeah,
that's wild.
If you watch, there's a movie called Boiler Room that almost. I
know I know the movie. I haven't watched it, but I know which one you're talking about.
Yeah, it just felt like to me that it was modeled off of my experience at MCI. It was about a call center. They were selling stocks, like bogus stocks, but same thing. They just shut it down, and so all of the investments, stock options, everything's gone because they freeze all the accounts. So you lose your job and your whole retirement and everything all at once, which was
And you found out by hitting chains on the door.
Yeah, you find out when you show up to work and there's a sign on the door that says we are closed.
That's got to be a shock.
Yeah, there's 1,000 people in Albuquerque that work there, and I still talk to most of them. The MCI family is super, super close, and all of us MCI workers, man, we've remained friends for all these years. And there were some incredible people that came out of that organization because the leadership locally was exceptional, and we would do so much leadership training, and it was a magnificent place to work. Unfortunately, the CEO, Bernie Ebbers, I think he died in prison, but he was like 74 at the time, and he got sentenced to I don't know what, it was like Bernie Madoff type of situation. So anyway, that was a pretty impactful experience for me. But the beautiful thing about it is I was really young. There were people who were nearing retirement.
Yeah.
Who found themselves in that exact same situation.
It makes a huge difference how much road you have ahead of you versus behind you when those kind of things happen.
Yeah, it really does. And I remember, when that happened, I just felt like my whole world had come tumbling down. Like, what am I going to do now? It's over. My whole career, my plan, my future, my life. Like this is. It felt so tragic. But I had some great mentors who were older who worked there, who said, "Man,
you're going to be okay.
You're going to be just fine.
That's awesome.
Don't worry about it." And so I really owe a debt of gratitude to all those people who helped me get my mind on straight. And then after that, I was contacted by we used to call them headhunters, but like a recruiter.
Yeah.
And this guy out of New York recruited me to go work for a mortgage company selling mortgages at a brokerage firm. And so I did the whole mortgage thing and did that for a number of years. And that was cool. But then what I really started doing was construction loans. I started funding people to build homes. I got into the construction lending market and actually became a preferred lender for a large national builder, and just found that I liked the construction part of the job better than sitting in the office doing the paperwork, writing 1003s, mortgage loan applications, running credit reports. All that stuff was like,
it's not for everybody.
Not as cool. I like to go out to the job site and walk the job and check it out. And so I went to work for a company out of Taos called Pumice Creek Building Systems of New Mexico. And it's an alternative building company where we use pumice aggregate to build homes. And I believe to this day, they're the finest quality homes in existence. I mean, they're just
So when you say use pumice aggregate, what does that look like? They make it into like a concrete type product?
We would do it all, yeah. So basically what you'd have is, imagine a 1/4 inch pumice aggregate. So you have, and it, you know, there's big pumice mines in the Hemis.
Yeah.
And you get all of these little pebbles that are super lightweight, so they're very inexpensive to ship because it's so light. I mean, it actually floats, right?
Yeah, I remember when they first filled Cochiti, going out there and seeing the rocks floating. That was so cool.
Yeah, it's so neat. But they're also very vesicular, meaning their pumice is full of air pockets.
Right.
You know, it's an igneous rock formed in a volcanic event, and it's filled with air pockets. And so we would take that aggregate, again, think of them like 1/4 inch pebbles, and then mix that 80% pumice aggregate, 10% Portland cement, and 10% water. And now you have almost the consistency of a Rice Krispie treat.
Okay.
That's what it looks like.
Right.
And now we're going to form up the entire building, so the whole house is poured in one monolithic pour. So it's one piece.
Okay.
So we form up the entire house, 14-inch thick walls minimum. Our pumice was getting an R value. R is the insulation rating,
I was about to ask that, yeah.
Stands for resistance to thermal transfer. That's where the R comes from. So it's basically a system that measures how insulative a material is, or what the insulation rating of a material is. So we're getting R2 per inch. So a 14-inch wall would be an R28 wall.
That's pretty good.
At that time, building code required R19
So
in your wall.
Exceeding that.
Greatly exceeding the R19 with an R28. But there's, and I won't geek out too much on this because your listeners will lose interest really, really fast. But
or be super interested. Like, we don't know who's listening.
I guess some people might like it, some might not. But if you think of insulation as an entire wall system,
right.
Well, a typical frame-built home, they'll tell you got R19 insulation. Well, you have R19 bats, but everywhere you have a stud, you have 1.5 inches of no insulation, essentially. No fiberglass insulation. You only have the R value of the stud. That's what's called a thermal break. You're losing efficiency in your building everywhere there's a stud. Does that make sense? Because you have a denser material that has less insulation, and energy is transferring through that thermal break. So in a pumice, even though I'm saying it's R28, the total R value of the wall system is significantly higher than you typically have on a frame-built home. So anyway, the other things that were really awesome about it, we're using this completely natural material. You're not going to ever have an issue with termites or insects or things like that because there's no wood. It's completely fireproof, which is amazing, you know, when we're building in mountain communities up in Taos and these areas. So there's so many benefits of this material. But anyway, I did that for a number of years and just absolutely loved it.
That's fascinating.
The challenge with the pumicecrete was just for me that it was seasonal because the temperature range has to be appropriate to pour the material.
I see.
So I'm generally out of work come about September, October, because then you're starting to get freezing at night and you can't pour and let that stuff set up and get frozen. You know, so if you're going to get freezing, you kind of have to shut it down and then not start up again until like May. You know, when you're so there was a narrow window during which I could do that. So I was doing mortgage loans in the wintertime, you know, working pumicecrete, you know, during when I could, when the weather was right. During that time, I did a project for Atrius Homes and Communities, which was an extreme makeover home edition, which was really, really cool. Did that in Albuquerque. You could find that on YouTube if you look it up. We had Ty Pennington out here, and we built this house for the Martinez family, and it was like a big 2-hour special episode on ABC. You know, Move That Bus. I don't know if you remember all that. When they revealed that. The reveal, exactly. So we basically showed up, knocked on this family's door, sent them to Disney World in Florida for a week, and in 4 or 5 days, we built them a brand new house. We remodeled a men's home that they were running. We built another woman's safe house for them. We demolished a strip of apartment buildings that had been condemned by the city and turned that into a city park. I mean, we did all this stuff like in 5 days.
Wow.
Yeah, if you get a chance, it's a cool episode.
You must have had an army.
We had a lot of people. tons of people, almost all volunteers. The majority of people were volunteers from the community, and all the materials were donated. That was my job, as I was the volunteer coordinator. So I had to round up the lumber yards to donate the lumber, and the stucco companies to donate the stucco and the windows. And anyway, it was a really neat experience. But that really got me focused on the construction stuff. And then the mortgage meltdown happened like 2007, 8.
Right.
And I was in the mortgage business, and man, that just, at that time I owned a company called Paramount Mortgage Group, and we had 3 locations. I think I had 14 loan officers at the time, 2 mortgage loan processors, and our lenders were just dropping like flies. As a broker, you're loaning other people's money.
Right.
You're just the go-between, connecting the customer to the bank, basically. But the banks were just dropping like flies to the point where we had no money to lend, because all the banks, New Century Mortgage, First Magnus, Countrywide, on and on and on. I could list 100 mortgage companies. They all went out of business. And so I tried keeping that business alive as long as I could, but it was just a drain. There was nothing coming in, and everything I'd saved going out. And so eventually, I don't know, must have been 2009, late 2008, early 2009, I just had no more money to keep things going, so we had to just shut it down, went out of business, closed up shop. So it was kind of felt a lot like the MCI thing.
I know, it sounds like you're kind of 0 for 2 on these things.
Like, man, again?
Right.
Here we go again. But Atrius Homes and Communities had called me and asked me if I wanted to go work sales for them, selling out of their sales office. And they were a big enough company, a big national home builder, that they could provide some in-house financing, because even though the customers couldn't really get loans. So I went and worked at Atrius until they closed and they went out of business. Businesses, the housing crash was a big recession, man. It was a big deal.
And it didn't happen instantly. It kind of spread out over multiple events.
That's right. Yeah. And so it all kind of trickled. Crazy. And so then I went to another home builder and worked for another home builder, and working for the production builders was kind of fun. I enjoyed it. But what I was finding, there was a lot of bait and switch tactics. Like, you'd have this model home that was so beautiful and decked out and granite countertops and everything's gorgeous. Your customers come in and you quote them a price, but you're generally quoting them the base price.
Right.
And then you get them all excited, and then they sign a contract, and they go to the design center, and they learn that everything they saw in the model
costs extra
money. And I struggled with that business model just because it felt disingenuous. It felt a little dishonest, actually, because we already had them under contract before they really learned all of the details of this kind of strategy that was being employed to get them excited, get them on paper, take them to the design center, and then, let's make sure that try to upgrade them, try to upsell them. And some people could, and some people couldn't. But either way, it was kind of
it leaves a bad taste in your mouth, regardless.
Yeah, I wasn't a huge fan of it. So at that time, I guess it would have been 2000. I don't know, whatever it was. I decided there's a better way to do home building, and so I contacted a builder buddy of mine, because I wasn't a general contractor. I had a lot of construction background. I'd worked in construction, but I hadn't been licensed.
Right.
So I called a buddy of mine who was a general contractor, licensed, lived in Las Cruces, and pitched this idea to create a different kind of home building company that built a model home, but every single thing in the model was included in the base price. So when a customer walks in, if you see
what they see,
you get it, period. Like, you don't have to ask. We'll have different colors to choose from, different things, but if you see granite countertops, you're getting granite countertops. You don't have to pick that one. Here's 3 others you could choose from, or you could have that one, but if you see it, you can have it. So it was a fantastic business model. We created a company called Casa Verde Builders, and ran that company for a number of years, and it was super successful. One of the challenges, though, our business model, we didn't have a ton of money for marketing. And so I said, well, let's just build a model home next to, say, D.R. Horton, a big national builder, because they're going to spend all the money on the marketing. They're driving traffic to their model.
All the people going to see their model are going to see yours.
Anyone that comes to their model is going to walk right next door. That's Why awesome. Wouldn't they, right? So they'll come next door, and then they'll see ours, and we don't even have to market. We're going to get business that way. And it was so effective. I mean, it was such a unbelievable time in my life to build that company and have that experience. The challenge is, though, eventually some of the big national builders kind of recognized our system, and what they did is they would just buy every lot in the subdivision. So there was no lot for us.
Right.
Before that, before we were on the scene, the way it used to work is each builder had generally a takedown schedule.
Okay.
So all the lots were owned by one developer. And then as a builder, you have your model home, and when you sell a house to a customer, they pick out the lot, and then you take it down.
Got it.
So then you would basically put that lot under contract, start construction, and so you're buying the lots as you needed them.
So you could go in and just buy a lot that wasn't spoken for.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then I'm in the neighborhood. And then when a customer picks out a lot, I just buy it it's already sold essentially.
Right. Yeah.
I buy it as I need it. But I never had the kind of financial resources to buy $4 million worth of lots at one time. But other competitors saw that we were getting, starting to grow our market share and getting a pretty good chunk of the pie. Yeah. And they said, we don't want them in our neighborhood, so we're just going to buy all the lots. And now they don't have a lot to put a model on. And even if they did, they don't have a lot to build their house on for a customer, no available lots. So that kind of was the end of Casa Verde Builders, which was kind of a production building company. We were building production stuff, and my business partner relocated to Phoenix. The market was blowing up out there, so he went to Phoenix to work, and I started a new home building company that specialized in custom homes. So we're building high-end custom homes on, custom lots, not in a neighborhood type of setting, not with a model home, and that kind of thing. So that's kind of how my career flowed. That's kind of my story as far as my home building career and my construction background. But when things were tough, while I was in the mortgage business still, but the mortgage meltdown was happening, I'm trying to sell houses, I was a licensed realtor, and I'm trying to make things work. It was during that period of time I got a request from a guy out of Wisconsin who was going to move to Albuquerque to open up a business. And he wanted to see if I could help him find a commercial space for his business and a house to move to. And I met the guy on an online forum called BoSite. There used to be, this is like before Facebook.
Yeah. I remember forums were big.
It was like a big thing.
Yeah, for a while.
And I was so broke. I had no money. And so for entertainment, if you have no money, all I could do is get on the computer and talk to people about bow hunting. And I'm living vicariously through these other bow hunters who were traveling around to Alaska and different places and sharing their stories on the forum and sharing pictures, and we're having conversations. And anyway, on that forum, you kind of get to know people, kind of. We all had handles. You didn't even know people's real name generally, but you had like this character name. And I was Arctic Chill. That was my name on BoSite. But this guy, Serbian Shark, that was his handle, Serbian Shark, out of Wisconsin, hit me up. He knew that I was a realtor, and hey, can you help me? So I said, sure. So his real name was Dan, but Dan came out, and I'm showing him around, and he asked me, he's like, tell me about your state's bow hunting organization. And I said, oh man, let me tell you about the Sandia Crest Bow Hunters Association. I said, we have a 100-acre range right here off the Zuzak's exit. We do 3D tournaments, we do barbecues, cookouts. Man, it's amazing. Like, it's so much fun. Great people, the greatest people you'll ever shoot with. The camaraderie. And he's like, that's awesome. What are you guys working on politically? Like, what are you working on as far as legislation? And I told him I have no idea what you're talking about.
Just like blank stare.
Yeah, I was like, oh, why would we do anything like that? That doesn't sound like very much fun. I was pretty young too, but I said, I'm not sure I'm following what you're talking about, Dan. And he's like, what I'm talking about is what are you doing to make sure that you'll be able to continue to bow hunt? What are you doing to make sure that you're getting a fair shake when it comes to the distribution of opportunity? What are you doing to fight for this activity you care so much about? You're passionate. You're on the bow site every single day. Like, you're talking to everybody. Like, you can't get enough bow hunting. Meanwhile, you're not doing anything to protect this sport that's essentially under attack. And I use the word sport kind of loosely, because to me it's so much more than a sport. It's a lifestyle, it's a mindset.
Right.
But anyway, he's saying he said, well, you should really find out what your state bow hunting organization is, the one that's involved at the state legislature, the one who's actually getting things done, doing important work. Like what you're talking about with Sandia Crest Bow Hunters Association is a shooting club. It's like a rod and gun club. Yeah. Like, it's cool, that's way cool. But you're going to have to do a lot more than that if you really want to protect this thing you care about. And so we went back to the office, my real estate office, because this is before you had computer on your phone, right? I think we had cell phones then, but they're like flip phones. You know, you could play Snake maybe or something.
Yeah.
But we went back to the office and did research on the internet and found out there was absolutely no state bow hunting organization. It didn't exist. And so he said, you've got to have one. He said, put the house hunt on hold. I'll worry about finding a commercial space later. The rest of the time I have here in New Mexico, we need to create a state bow hunting organization. New Mexico is a destination state, one of the best places in the world to bow hunt. People travel from all over the world, and you've got nobody showing up at the state legislature fighting for this stuff, like advocating for it. You know, he said, that's insane to me. You know, we've got to do it. So we did. In the next few days, we got our bylaws and articles of organization and all the paperwork.
That's amazing. He was willing to do all that.
Yeah, it was fantastic, and it was so important to him. And he was heavily involved with the Wisconsin Bow Hunters Association, so he had access to all the documents, which made it easier. He had his secretary send over all their documents, and then we just adjusted them.
Yeah, sure, copy their homework.
Yeah, exactly. Make them relevant for New Mexico. And that's how the United Bow Hunters of New Mexico was founded, UBNM. And at the founding meeting, which happened on the patio of Rudy's Barbecue on Carlisle, because that's where I used to work through college. I was a pit master at Rudy's Barbecue, which I love it to this day. But anyway, I called my buddy. I said, hey, do you mind if I have a big meeting on your patio? I got to get a bow hunting organization started. And he said, no, have at it. It's all yours. I'll put a reserved sign and the patio's yours for this evening. So I put an advertisement out on the New Mexico page of Bow Site, like, attention New Mexico bow hunters, we don't have a state organization, and we need to get our stuff together and get organized and make sure we have a voice with our decision makers up in Santa Fe. Yeah. You know, Santa Fe is, like a lot of state capitals, is fairly progressive, and they got some ideas that don't always support a robust future for hunting or angling or outdoor activities. You know, there's people with varying views on those kinds of things, and we need to make sure that our interests are properly represented. And so I basically wrote that up in an advertisement on Bow Site, and I don't remember how many people showed up on that patio, but it was packed.
That's awesome.
I mean, it was packed. Bow hunters, everybody from Bow Site that I'd always talked to for a year longer, you know, but never had met.
Yeah.
Now we're all meeting each other in person. And I said, we need a treasurer, and John Pierce volunteered. He became our treasurer. We need a secretary, and Greg Burpo became our secretary. We got a vice president. And I said, now we need a president. And it's like crickets. Like, well, someone needs to run this thing. You know, who's willing to put in the time and stuff? And no one's saying anything. And then finally one guy's like, you're the president. You started all this.
That's what I was thinking. I was like, they're probably all thinking that.
Yeah. I said,
like,
no.
That's what you're doing right now.
I said, look, guys, I appreciate that, but I absolutely cannot be the president. Like, I'm struggling to make ends meet. I'm trying to run a real estate deal. I'm trying to sell houses. I'm trying to do mortgages. I'm trying to, like, I'm struggling. I don't have any additional time to devote towards this thing. And boy, they didn't want to hear that. They're like, so you pulled this whole thing together and told us how important it is to get involved, and now you're saying you don't want to be involved. I'm like, no, I didn't say that. I'll be involved. I just don't want to be the president. They're like, you don't have a choice, pal. You're the president.
So you're like George Bailey. We'll keep the building loan open. But Jesse, you're it.
Exactly. That's exactly right. That's so funny. So anyway, I became the president, and that evening, at the conclusion of the meeting, a guy walked over to me by the name of Jeremy Vesbach, and at the time, he was the executive director of the New Mexico Wildlife Federation. I'd never heard of the organization. I was unfamiliar with it. He was from Montana. We're super close friends to this day. He's now with another conservation organization called Western Resources Advocates, but he was also on our state game commission a couple of years ago. He's just an unbelievable guy, brilliant conservationist, brilliant organizer, great leader. But he walked up to me after the meeting and he said, hey, here's my business card. You know, this is awesome what you're doing, because we absolutely need bow hunters up in Santa Fe. Everything you said is spot on. And of course, I gave Dan all the credit. I said, it was this other guy's idea. He just, you know, made me do it. And so Jeremy said, come by my office. I want to introduce you to my office manager, because I want to support you. If you need anything, you can use my office as your headquarters. Use it just like it's your office. If, you know, like, let's work together. And so that's how I came to know the New Mexico Wildlife Federation and built a really close working relationship with them. Jeremy took me up to the Roundhouse, introduced me to all the state legislators so I could get to know the senators and get to know the representatives. And, outside of like 7th grade political history class, I'd never really been involved in how a bill becomes a law.
Yeah.
What's the difference between a rule and a statute? What does a game commission even do? Like all of the stuff that's really, really important that governs the way that we live.
That most of us know nothing about.
Exactly.
Or next to nothing. Like, we saw the cartoon on Saturday morning, It's like, I don't know how bills work. It's a little cartoon bill goes up on the steps and gets sad. Like,
Exactly. I was so clueless to it, but Jeremy just took me under his wing and taught me how to be an advocate and how to talk to elected officials and why I needed to do those things and how to organize, how to get people together. And so in any case, I worked with Jeremy for a couple of years. Then he was leaving the organization. And so he contacted me and said, hey, I'm leaving the Wildlife Federation. Would you be interested in taking over as executive director? I think you should apply. And man, I so desperately wanted to do it, Glenn, at that time. I really did. I wanted nothing more than to do this work professionally. Because up until this point, the whole time I'm with UBNM, all that, I'm just a volunteer.
it's a side.
Yeah, this is just all my free time is being used up doing all this stuff. I mean, there was no income. But what he's proposing is you can come do this for work and actually get paid and do what you're already doing, but now it's also your job. Right. And the problem was, after the big mortgage meltdown and the housing crash and all that, my finances were in such shambles that I just couldn't make the numbers work. Nonprofits, I say, you can do it as a job, which is true, you can get paid, but it doesn't necessarily pay like you would make in the private sector. Right. I mean, it is a nonprofit organization, and nonprofit leadership and the boards of directors on nonprofits have to be very strong stewards of the resources. People are giving donations and grants or providing funding and things, but you've got to really use those resources appropriately in order to be a successful organization. Yeah. And so pay is what it is, but it wasn't, I just couldn't make it work at that time. And I was so depressed. I remember just being so bummed because I wanted it so bad, but it just wasn't possible. So instead, a guy by the name of Garrett Veniclausen took the job. And Garrett's an amazing, he's now with the New Mexico Wilderness Alliance. Yeah. But Garrett's an exceptional guy all the way around. Huge, bigger than life, charismatic, unbelievable hunter and angler, and just a big-hearted guy, amazing individual. And so Garrett and I worked really closely together while he ran the Federation for, maybe 6 or 7 years. And I still had UBNM. And then Garrett ran for state land office. He ran to be a state land commissioner. And so he took a leave of absence from the Federation and ran his campaign. And then at the conclusion of the campaign, decided that he didn't want to go back to the office job. And so he contacted me, just similar to the way Jeremy had, and said, hey man, I'm leaving the Federation. I think you should apply. And so I reevaluated the numbers, and over the course of the time Garrett was there, my finances, my personal situation had changed. Right. The economy had changed and things were different. And I decided, I think I can make this work now. And so I submitted my application, and now that's how I sit in front of you today as the executive director of the New Mexico Wildlife Federation for over 5 years now.
That's amazing.
That's a really long story.
Journey. No, but that's the thing is, it's like to hear the journey. It's there's so many cases where people are like, overnight success, and it's like an overnight 20-year success. Like you just, it's not like you just fell into this. And so it's really cool to kind of put the pieces together and the links in that chain, and especially the people, you had a lot of important people come in at the right moment, and that light bulb moment where he's like, you guys need to look out for your bow hunting. Yeah. And so that's fascinating. It's so cool to hear that.
Yeah, it's been an amazing journey, and I wouldn't change any of it, really. I mean, I wouldn't change a thing about it. It's been so fantastic, and I've grown so much and matured so much as a conservationist. And when I started, I wanted to make sure I could always bow hunt. Like that was kind of my primary motivating factor. Right. It was a little bit selfish, quite frankly. It's like, I love to bow hunt, and I want to make sure nobody ever takes that away from me. As long as I'm able to pull a string back, I'm a bow hunter and that's the way it's going to be. And now that I've been doing this work professionally for so long, I still am just as passionate about bow hunting as I ever have been, but it's not about me and it's not about my ability to bow hunt. It's about effective and proper stewardship of our collectively owned natural resources. It's about ensuring that wildlife thrives on the landscape so that your kids and their kids and their kids get to have some of the experiences that I've had, you know. And one of my mentors who I recorded a podcast on my platform with a couple of years ago is Shane Mahoney. And we were talking earlier about the North American model of wildlife conservation. Right. Shane is the one who's largely credited with getting that model adopted by every state wildlife agency in this country. So he was working with Dr. Valerius Geist at the time, and they created this, they compiled these principles, the 7 tenets, and Shane went on tour traveling the United States. He lives in Newfoundland, Canada. He owns a company called Conservation Visions. But it's really fascinating because he tells a story, and Shane, he serves on the board of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, the IUCN. I mean, he's world-renowned conservationist. And he has a really amazing project underway right now that I'm a partner on. It's called the Wild Harvest Initiative, which is spectacular, and that could be a whole show of its own. But Shane tells a story that really resonates with me, and he says, you know, he travels the whole world. He's every corner of the planet. He knows the cultures and knows the people. And he said, you could take children from every country, you know, pick a selection of children from around the world and put them in a gymnasium. All these kids, different backgrounds, different, you know, learned experiences, and put all of the best toys that we've ever made in that room. Take the most popular toys of today and put them all in that room and let the kids just have a free-for-all playing with all of those toys. He's like, it'd be beautiful watching all these little kids fascinated in playing with the toys. But he said, now take an animal, any animal, and put it in the middle of that gymnasium. A frog or a turtle, doesn't matter. He said every kid, like, they lose interest in the toy, and they just gravitate towards a snake or towards a skunk or whatever it is that you chose. He said that's the connection that we as humans have with what he refers to as the wild others. You know,
so awesome.
With wild animals, it's like there's this connection. And so as I've kind of grown in my conservation journey, the hunting is incredibly important to me and something I'll always advocate for and ensure is allowed to exist in well-regulated, well-managed, humane, appropriate ways. I mean, that, you know, that's important. It's important that it's done right and that it's respectful and that it's proper, but I'll always support that. But now it's like my goals are so much more broad, you know, and so much more inclusive of other people's interest in wildlife also. I mean, I work closely with the Audubon Society, and they love to go out and bird watch, and I think that's phenomenal. I love that, you know.
Well, let me ask you, because I've talked to you at length about this, and I love the perspective on conservation and how that ties into hunting, fishing, and it feels like to me that there's a big disconnect between a lot of the nature loving outdoor people and that. And is that what you actually see is because you know, the Subaru driving you know, folks from Portland, Oregon, like they don't support the hunting, but they love camping and hiking and going out into our public lands.
Yeah. Well, you know, it's really fascinating. I'm glad you brought this up, because growing up, when things were on VHS tapes. You know, you'd go to Walmart and you'd buy a hunting video on a VHS tape. It was all about how many kill shots there were. It was all about the death of the animals, like, and they were titled weird things like Bloodbath Episode 4 or whatever, you know, like, what? This is crazy. So hunters did a really, really bad job for a long time of marketing the activity, communicating, telling their story. Right. They told a horrific story that didn't resonate with a lot of very reasonable people. So that created some problems. And so throughout most of my life, what you say is absolutely true, that there's been a huge tension between environmentalists and hunters. It's like hunters would call them the bunny huggers or the tree huggers. They would call us, you know, the knuckle draggers or whatever, you know, the cavemen, the barbaric savages, whatever the names were. So there was this huge friction there. And I've really noticed an improvement in relations over my time doing this. And I firmly believe that every single hunter should absolutely be an environmentalist. You know, so rather than having this disconnect. But so to the points that you're bringing up, one of the things that's helping the most to reshape that dynamic is this movement towards locavores, this movement towards sustainable food production, this movement towards healthy, natural, organic, free of hormones, free of antibiotics, all of those things. That's really driving some improvements in the relations between Sierra Club and the New Mexico Wildlife Federation. It's comprised mostly of hunters. So when I go into a Whole Foods, it's interesting because a lot of the people in the Whole Foods store would not be supportive of hunting on the surface. But they're looking at the meat counter and they're wanting organic, free range, pesticide free, hormone free. Like, they want all of that stuff. And so it only takes a little conversation generally. It takes a little conversation to get us on the same page. And
there's so much more commonality than there is differences. Just a couple of key things.
There's so much more that we share in common than what we have in disagreement. But for so long, hunters did a really bad job of trying to bring those other people towards us. Instead, we pushed them away. We said, what do you're just emotional softy or whatever, snowflake. We'd come up with terms that we'd call people these things, It's like, you've got a lot of history in the firearm stuff. And if you meet someone who maybe isn't comfortable with firearms, maybe they're afraid of them, they're just they've not been around them, they've not been exposed to them, they didn't grow up with them. Like, you could go to that person and call them names, be like, oh, you're such a pansy, you're nothing but a FUD. Well, that's not going to be very productive.
No, it shuts them down like that. They're done with you.
And the perception that they have of firearms owners is negative. They're just a bunch of bullies. They're just, they're whatever. They're so proud of themselves because they feel big and tough because they have a gun or whatever.
And like the hunters, a lot of the firearms owners aren't helping the cause because of the things they say and how they act. And it's like, gosh, we can't even have conversations about, and I'm not sure if hunting's as bad, but I know guns is just like, that's one of those words that people throw out and then the conversation's done.
It has been like that for a long time with hunting. But it's starting to change. But see, hunters, we don't have paid ambassadors to tell our story. We're the ones who have to do it. And so a lot of my work involves educating hunters how to communicate with someone who maybe doesn't understand or appreciate or even believe hunting should exist. And I talk to them all the time, whether it's animal protection voters of New Mexico, defenders of wildlife, Wild Earth Guardians. I'm in meetings with these people all the time. And a lot of hunters initially would criticize me, say, "Man, you're sleeping with the enemy. I don't know what you do. It's a bad choice of bedfellows." Have all these different phrases to essentially try to discourage me from having these conversations. But these conversations are so impactful and so powerful. And when I meet someone who's, say, an anti-hunter, and I use that term, I don't use that term often because there's very few of them, quite frankly. I mean, there's people who disagree with killing a bear or disagree with a lion, or they don't think you should kill it just to hang it on your wall. But when it comes right down to the concept of...
There's some version of hunting that they'll agree with.
Almost always. Even the most staunch animal rights activist that I'm aware of in this state has told me multiple times, and this is a person who's a vegan, who doesn't eat meat, won't touch meat, doesn't have anything to do with meat, doesn't like hunting at all, any way, shape, or form. Even that person, and I won't say their name on the show, but even that person who lives here and who I work with on a regular basis tells me, I'll tell you this, if a person's gonna eat meat, I much prefer them to hunt it like you do than to buy it from some industrially produced, factory farmed, inhumanely raised production facility. Like, if you're gonna eat meat, which I wish you wouldn't, but if you're gonna, the way you do it is the best way. And that's the most, that's the biggest anti-hunter I happen to know.
That's awesome.
Even approves of hunting over other forms of food procurement. So I don't use the term anti-hunting often, but if I'm talking to an anti-hunter, one thing I know right from the start is that they absolutely love wildlife. They love it so much that they've created this identity about themselves that they don't want you to kill it. And it's like, well, I love wildlife too, like a lot. So already we're kind of on the same page. The one thing we disagree with is this tiny little aspect of it where I pull the trigger, squeeze the trigger. Sorry, coach.
That's fine. I know what you meant.
Yeah. So where we differ is that I'll squeeze the trigger and they'll just squeeze the trigger on the shutter for their camera.
Right.
We're just shooting it with a different tool. But that's the only, like that one little piece. The rest of my hunt, which might be, I recently went on a month-long hunt in Alaska. I traversed 211 miles across the Yukon Charlie
That's so awesome.
Rivers National Preserve, right? Solo, 100% by myself, over the course of a month, traveling 211 miles through an Alaskan wilderness hunting caribou. Well, if I play the minute by minute by minute play of that entire month with an anti-hunter, they'll disagree with me for about 2 seconds of a month long
just
trip.
that moment.
That moment that I shot a caribou, they don't like it. And that's fine. They have that, everybody has a right to their own opinion. But the rest of the trip where I'm photographing caribou and I'm watching wild
It's all the
wolves
same that they would want to do.
They would love it. They would love every second of it.
Do you think, not with the knowledgeable activists, but just sort of the general population, do you think a lot of people still buy the we're hunting the buffalo into extinction kind of model of that's what hunting is? You're going to, like if you're hunting the deer, we're going to lose all our deer, Is that still a thing really, or is...
I don't think so. I certainly don't come across that very often. Every once in a while, I'll talk to someone who doesn't realize how regulated hunting is.
Right, and that's that's why I haven't had a lot of in-depth conversations, but I can just imagine there's a knowledge deficit there.
Sometimes, I think it's fairly small. But sometimes you meet someone and they think you just get a gun, you go out, you shoot whatever you want, as many as you want. They don't realize that there's season dates and limits and restrictions on the gender that you have to harvest or whatever it might be, the size requirement sometimes. There's a lot of rules. I mean, there's so many rules in hunting that every year we have to produce at the New Mexico Department of Game and Fish numerous books to tell you what all the rules are. Like, there's books that are species specific. This for big game, this for small game, this for fish. So it's very, very regulated. But one of the things that I think a lot of Americans have come to recognize is that in this country, almost every single animal that's hunted or fished for is thriving to the point of almost becoming a nuisance to the population. But the animals that we're fighting to protect, that we're fighting to save, are only those animals that are not hunted. Right. I mean, the willow flycatcher, that's a bird that we're trying to save. No one's hunting the willow flycatcher. The silvery minnow, the desert sand lizard. I mean, there's any number of species you can think of that are endangered. Mexican gray wolves we were talking about earlier, those are all species that are not hunted. The hunted species like white-tailed deer, insurance companies in the East wish we could do something to reduce the population of these deer because they're costing motorists billions of dollars a year in vehicle collisions. I mean, wild turkeys have become a nuisance in so many places across this country. They get on people's cars, they scratch up their paint. We were talking earlier about all the wildlife that you have around this place, which is
robust. We have a lot.
Yeah, so if there was an Endangered Species Act at the turn of the century, almost every single species in existence today would have been on the list.
Right.
That's how decimated our wildlife populations were. But I think a lot of people have come to realize that it's the funding provided by the sale of hunting licenses and fishing licenses that have funded the conservation efforts that have brought all of these populations back to very, very, very healthy, robust numbers. I've recently read that we likely have more white-tailed deer in North America today than we did when Europeans first made contact.
Wow.
So we've done an amazing job as Americans in rebuilding our wildlife populations. And I feel like now we're turning the corner on what our focus is. So before we were in a recovery mode, trying to recover our wildlife populations. Now we've done that. Now we're more in a management mode, and
trying to achieve a balance.
Exactly, trying to achieve the balance. And what hunters largely are afraid of is what happens if we can achieve the balance without the need for a lot of hunting. That's what scares hunters. That's why there's so many hunters that are afraid of wolves. And they're not afraid of wolves in that they're going to get attacked by a wolf.
Right, I know what you mean.
Wolves
they're
don't
afraid
attack
the wolves are going to work them out of a job.
They're afraid. Well, the wolves are employed by the anti-hunters to keep the game populations in check so I don't get a chance to do it.
Yeah.
And I mean, I could see how someone thinks like that, but when I hear people talk about that, hunters in particular, it's kind of funny because everybody I know who likes to hunt dreams of hunting Alaska. They, man, I want to hunt in Alaska.
Right. Yeah.
Like, well, guess what state has more wolves than any other state in the country? It's Alaska. Yeah. So you're saying you're afraid of the wolves. You don't want to be where there's wolves because there'll be no hunting. But the number one place you want to go to hunt is the place with the most wolves.
Full of wolves.
So, like, I think the threat, I can see where the thought process comes from. Mm-hmm. I don't know that it's a super valid threat. I think we can manage an ecosystem so that we have sustainable populations of predators and prey and provide
there's still room for
plenty of opportunity for hunters to go out and participate in this age-old tradition. I mean, this heritage, this traditional land use of procuring your own food. And that's the thing for me, Glenn, that as I've matured, as a kid, you just want to get something, you just want to shoot. You go through all the 5 stages of hunting. There's actually 5 defined stages of a hunter. But one of the things that I'm so passionate about is the food production part of it. Because when I take that bull elk off the mountain, for one thing, I saw it alive and I observed it and I even interacted with it. I called to it and it called back and we did a dance and we had a conversation and we got to know each other. And if everything works out perfect, which it usually doesn't, I mean, most of the times you're going to fail. But every once in a while, it all works out perfect and you end up harvesting that animal. Now I'm miles into the wilderness and I got to get it out. So I'm taking it apart piece by piece with great care and precision, and I'm carrying it out on my back for miles, and getting it to the truck. And then I'm taking it home, and then I'm, making my sausages and cutting my steaks and preparing my roasts and doing all my things. And then when I feed that meal to friends or family, I've such a deep connection to it.
Right. It's not just a styrofoam plastic wrapped thing from the supermarket.
Right. I have a relationship with it. And I think that, and I have so much respect and appreciation. I read recently that in the United States, 40% of all food produced is thrown in the trash.
Right.
Wasted.
Yeah,
40%.
I heard that recently too.
That's kind of a scary thing. Mm-hmm. That's a lot of waste, and I just feel like when I've taken that animal's life, and I was an active participant in that. So someone that goes to the store and buys it on a piece of styrofoam wrapped in cellophane, there's a little disconnect there. I mean, they're still eating meat. They contributed to the death of the animal because there's a demand and they created that demand. But they didn't do it themselves. They weren't an active participant.
You're a lot more invested in the actual meat that you're putting on the table.
I feel like I am. I don't want to.
You are.
I don't want to come off sounding arrogant or something, but
I think you express very well the deep connection that you feel to the whole process, which I think, especially when you look at a lot of these kind of processes like hunting or even death, like modern Americans are rarely exposed to birth or death.
Yeah.
People used to die in their own homes and they would die surrounded by their families. Their family saw death. They grew their own animals and, slaughtered them for food or hunted. And so there was a much deeper direct connection. And I feel like we're kind of designed for that.
Yeah, I agree.
Like we're not designed to be totally disconnected. And then if you roll in the totality of circumstances of, comparing that elk's life to the cow's life,
exactly.
Quality of life, environmental impact, that's where it seems like people probably could get more on board if they just kind of really stopped and thought about what does, cattle farming or cattle ranching or even farming vegetables to eat do environmentally versus harvesting things in the wild.
See, and what you said right there is exactly what Shane Mahoney's Wild Harvest Initiative is designed to answer those questions. Yeah. Because one of the things that we don't think about, just hypothetically speaking, if someone had a magic wand and said, as of right now in this country, there will be no more hunting, 0, done, hunting's finished. Well, what Shane's calculating, and again, Wild Harvest Initiative, for any of your listeners that want to see it, you Google that and you'll find all the resources you want. But is how many meals per year in this country are acquired by hunting and angling. Okay, so now you have so it starts off with animals, and then it goes to pounds and portions, and it's very, very scientific approach to figuring this out. But ultimately what you end up with is a certain number of meals that will no longer exist, because if we stop the wild harvest of those meals, then they would have to be replaced by something else.
Right.
And what is that something else? Well, it's industrial production. Well, what's the environmental impact of that? What's the social impact of that? What's the conservation cost? How much do we lose in conservation funding? All of those questions are being answered in the Wild Harvest Initiative, and it's it's such a fascinating thing. But that disconnect that you're talking about it's really tragic in a lot of ways, and I'll do my best to try to explain it a little bit. Kids that think that meat comes from a drive-through window,
Right.
and don't have this concept. And I know that sounds crazy, but I actually had a kid at my home in Edgewood a few years ago. He was staying with us, and I have chickens. I have a flock of chickens, and I asked the kid, "Hey, do you want to go help me collect chicken eggs?" "Oh yeah, that sounds awesome." Get a basket and go out into the chicken coop and pull the hens off the nesting boxes and take the eggs. And it was great, because I have different kinds of chickens, and they lay different colors of eggs. So you've got some brown ones, some white ones, some green ones, some blue ones. The Americanas lay colorful Easter egg chickens, we call them. So we gather up all these eggs, and then ask the kid, "How many eggs do you want for breakfast?" "Oh, I don't want any." "Oh, you don't like eggs?" "No, I do like eggs, but I only like store eggs. I don't like chicken eggs." That's a true story.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's that way in a lot of aspects of society, I think. Not anything to do with animals or hunting, but I was watching a documentary on YouTube the other day with my daughter about the Shackleton expedition down in Antarctica, and that fascinating and fantastic story.
Yeah, right.
The endurance, and the guy narrating it is clearly an adult. There's actually two or three guys. They had a narrator and then two guys that just talked through the whole thing. But one of the guys kept referencing, he's like, "And we're looking at actual photos and video from the Shackleton expedition." And it just caused me to pause, and I'm like, he has no idea. Like, he literally doesn't know what he just said. And it's not to disparage this guy. Like, it's just people are no longer seeing actual films like we saw in grade school. They'd roll, put it on the thing and actually run it through. And so they don't really understand that, like, it hasn't always been video.
Right, exactly.
And the same with food, and any of the food in the grocery store, I can see where people just have no real inkling of what even the animal looked like.
Right, exactly. No, you're spot on, and I respect. I have great respect, Glenn, for people who try to be conscientious, for people who try to make really good, responsible decisions for the planet, for the environment, for future generations, for themselves, for their own health, for all those things. So I have a lot of friends who are vegans and vegetarians and pescatarians and every kind of tarian you could think of. I've got plenty of that. But if you're eating tofu, then so much wildlife habitat was destroyed to put in soybean farms, right? And there's the production of those soybeans that they're going to use to make that tofu is a monoculture. If you're in agriculture, if you're growing corn, if you're growing soybeans, anything that exists on your plot that is not your intended crop reduces efficiency.
Right.
So whether it's a grasshopper or a blade of grass is drinking the water that you intended for your soybeans, or pulling nutrients from the soil that you intended for your soybean. A grasshopper is eating the leaves of your soybean plant. Anything on that parcel that's not what your intended crop is reduces efficiency. And so agricultural production has turned into these monocultures that do not have biodiversity existent on that parcel. So that's a huge cost to our environment. That's a huge cost to the wildlife that depended on that. And so I'm not saying people shouldn't eat tofu. I'm not trying to create a movement banning veganism or anything like that. I'm just trying to illustrate that everything we do has an impact. That life is a death-dependent process.
Everything costs something.
When the rototiller tills that field, it's cutting up snakes and ground-burrowing rodents like mice, and maybe a fox with a den of pups is getting rototilled up in the process of this giant commercial operation. And I don't mean to sound gruesome on the show and turn people off with this, but I feel like so many people if it's out of sight, it's out of mind.
Yeah.
Like they don't see it, then
no,
they don't worry
exactly.
about it.
Or you know, and maybe it's not even something they were aware of, and then they forgot about it. They just never knew. You know,
Right.
and so I think education. I think is the solution to many of our problems. like if you really knew, then we might make different decisions. You know, except for the really greedy, awful people that make decisions for the wrong reasons. But most people, I think, want to do the right thing, and I think, it's just a matter of the education piece and not just a knee-jerk, politicized reaction or.
Well, we've seen it with like product selections where the BLM, Bureau of Land Management, exists under the Department of Interior. They just passed a huge rule, oil and gas reform rule, just this past week. And I've applauded the BLM for doing it because what it does, it raises lease rates, raises royalties, it increases the bonding fee that big companies have to put down when they start extraction, so that when they're finished, the money's there to clean up the mess, so that we're not paying for it as taxpayers cleaning up the mess. And these oil and gas companies are making record profits. They can afford to pay a more fair lease price that hadn't been updated since 1960.
Wow.
Last time their lease price was updated was 1960. I mean, imagine if you're, if you're basing your financial decisions on a 1960 dollar compared to today's dollars. So it needed to be updated. But there's a lot of negativity always towards the oil and gas industry.
Right.
But the reality is that that's a resource that we're all using, and there's people driving a Prius who I talk to at the Roundhouse or I run into at various advocate meetings or engagements, and there are some people who just really feel like that they're not part of the problem. Like, oh, well, look at me, I've got this electric vehicle, so I'm not part of the problem. Like, well, where are you charging that? Where's the energy coming from that's being used to charge it? And I'm not, saying that we don't need renewable energy.
Right.
I'm not saying that that's not the way of the future. I'm not opposed to electric vehicles. I'm just really trying to make the point that everything has an impact. We all have an impact. I'm working right now with the BLM on their solar DEIS, basically as a draft environmental impact statement, because they want to open up 22 million acres of our public lands to solar development. And I get that we're in a place where renewable energy is a big deal. We need it economically. We need it because I like to turn the light switch on and have it actually turn on lights. And I get all that, but I'm heavily involved in helping to decide where these things should not go. Like, there are places that I don't want to see covered up with acres and acres of solar panels as far as you can see. The destruction of wildlife habitat. So even renewable energy, it's great, but it has an impact.
Right.
And windmills have an impact.
Right.
So, helping every person understand that life is a death-dependent process. Whether you're buying your meat from the store or whether a hunter's going out and procuring it off of our public lands and taking public wildlife, we all are contributing to some impact on this planet. And the more that people recognize that, I think the better off we all are.
Oh, I totally agree. So you mentioned the hunting and fishing funding the public lands, and I just wanted to revisit that a little bit because you've talked about the Robertson-Pittman?
Yeah, Pittman-Robertson Act.
Pittman-Robertson.
You've got the Pittman-Robertson Act of 1937. So it's kind of interesting. I'm, executive director of the New Mexico Wildlife Federation. We were founded in 1914 by Aldo Leopold. I love saying that. I'm always bragging about that. The big point of pride for me that I'm running an organization founded by Aldo Leopold.
That's very cool.
I just love that. So I feel like I'm walking in his shoes. And a lot of times when we're making policy decisions, I ask myself, what would Aldo do? And that's kind of how we make decisions at the organization. But we're affiliated with the National Wildlife Federation. We're not a branch of it. We're a separate autonomous organization. But the National Wildlife Federation has 52 state affiliates, and those state affiliates drive the policy for the national organization. We vote on resolutions, and we essentially set the policy for national. But I bring up the National Wildlife Federation because they were founded in 1936, and the very first thing they did, the first impactful thing they did upon formation was to pass, or help pass, the Pittman-Robertson Act of 1937. And what that act did is created an excise tax on all firearms and ammunition. So it's 11 to 13%. So it's 11% on rifles and 13% on pistols, and anyway, I don't need to get into all the details, but basically it creates an excise tax, and that excise tax is what funds our state wildlife agencies. So every single state, this is getting a little complicated, but hopefully I don't bore your listeners with this, but our public lands are managed at the federal level.
Right.
So we have the United States Forest Service, we have the Bureau of Land Management. Those are both federal agencies. Wildlife, however, is managed at the state level. Wildlife is a public trust resource, okay, that's held in trust for the beneficiaries of the trust. And the beneficiaries of the trust are residents of the state. So this is where things get a little interesting, because anybody in the country wants to come and camp on our national forest, it's theirs just as much as it's yours or mine, even though it's in New Mexico,
right?
Because it's a national forest.
Yeah.
But if someone else wants to come and hunt elk here, well, if they're not a resident of New Mexico, then they're on a little bit of a different, what's the right word? They're a different level of priority, or supposed to be, because the wildlife belongs to the residents of the state. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
So it's kind of an interesting.
No, and I think
dynamic.
it's super important for the listeners or viewers to kind of hear that broken down, because I grew up, I didn't do a lot of hunting, but I did some hunting growing up. I grew up here in Wisconsin, and my dad hunted, and I think he was kind of on the tail end of his hunting days when,
Right.
so he took me a bit when I was very young, and I didn't know any of this stuff though.
Yeah.
I went to hunter safety and then went out in the woods and tried to find an animal, and
Right.
But I think it's both fascinating, and I think it's very important for people to know kind of how all that flows, to understand. And then when you start talking about problems like the elk hunters from out of the state, it makes a lot more sense.
Yeah.
Like, why is that a problem?
Exactly.
Especially to somebody who doesn't even like hunting. Like, why should I be concerned about
Right.
out-of-state elk hunters?
So I bring all that up, and this will all tie back together. I know it sounds like I'm kind of all over the place here. Hopefully this comes back together in a nice package, but because the wildlife belongs to the residents of the state, every single state has its own state wildlife agency. They're called different things. In Missouri, you have the Missouri Conservation Department, or Department of Conservation. Texas, you have Texas Parks and Wildlife. New Mexico, we have the New Mexico Department of Game and Fish. There's a lot of controversy around that. People want to get the word game out of there. So, because they're not just managing our game, they're managing all of our wildlife,
Right.
even those species we don't hunt. And that's true, and I'm fine with that. I don't get caught up on it. It's not, I don't lose sleep over what we call the agency.
Right.
I lose sleep over the agency not doing their job when they're supposed to,
There
but
you go.
the name of the agency is not my biggest focus. Nonetheless, though, that is our state wildlife agency. Well, most people don't realize that they are not funded with your taxpayer dollars. So your gross receipts tax, when you go to the store and buy stuff, doesn't fund them. Right. Your property tax, when you're paying on your property that fund your schools and libraries, doesn't fund the New Mexico Department of Game and Fish. It's what's called an enterprise agency. So in New Mexico, our state wildlife agency has a budget about $47 million per year. That money comes from the hunting and fishing license sales. Okay, so they sell licenses to people like me who buy them and go out to hunt for wildlife or fish for wildlife. For every dollar they generate from hunting and fishing license sales, they get $3 from the feds. So if I bought a license for $1, they're going to get my dollar plus 3 more coming from the feds. Those 3 coming from the feds are coming from the Pittman-Robertson Act of 1937. Those excise taxes on firearms and ammunition is what's funding our state wildlife agencies. That's the case with every state in the country with the exception of 3 kind of. The state of Missouri, they fund their state wildlife agency with 1/8 of 1% of their gross receipts tax. So 1/8 of 1% of gross receipts tax goes to fund their agency. They still get the federal match, and they still sell licenses, but their department is so much better funded than ours. And you notice it when you go to Missouri. You will not pay at a state park. You don't pay at a boat ramp. You want to launch your boat, there's no fees. It's not like here you go to the camping area, the picnic area, and you have a day use fee and all that.
Yeah.
You don't have to worry about any of that stuff in Missouri because it's all covered because everybody pays into the system. Arkansas has a similar structure, and Georgia has a similar structure, although Georgia's is based on certain products. So the taxes from certain items go to fund the state agency. Colorado has some of their lottery money now going to Colorado Parks and Wildlife, but overwhelmingly, state wildlife agencies are enterprise agencies not receiving taxpayer dollars. So that's one reason that hunters and anglers are so critical, is we're buying those licenses, and then for every dollar we spend, they get $3 more in federal match. But hunters often overemphasize our contribution to conservation because it's the people who are shooting a lot of ammunition and buying a lot of guns, but mostly ammunition, because,
And those aren't all hunters.
They're not all hunters. In fact, the majority are not. Right. If I buy a box of 20 rounds for my 30-06, that'll last me 10 years. Yeah. I shoot one to make sure I'm zeroed in. The next one I should be taking an animal. Yeah. I sometimes shoot more just for fun, but the point is, a box of 20 shells or cartridges that might cost me $50 could last me a long time. But if I was to go out to the shooting range to do some competitive shooting, whether I'm shooting a clay pigeon round or doing tactical training with an AR-15, I could easily go through hundreds and hundreds or even thousands of rounds in a single session. Yeah. That's totally possible, right? So I think it's important for people to realize that firearms ownership and the purchase of firearms and ammunition is largely responsible for funding our state wildlife agencies. The other thing is, I wish I knew the exact year, but after Pittman-Robertson was passed, some years later, we passed another act called the Dingell-Johnson Act, which is modeled after Pittman-Robertson. It essentially does the exact same thing, except it's on fishing equipment. So marine fuel, if you ever buy fuel at a dock for your boat instead of at the gas station, you'll notice it's a lot more because there's taxes added to the marine fuel to go into the Pittman-Robertson fund. If you're buying fishing hooks, fishing line,
and so that act just feeds into the same fund.
It all feeds into the same fund, and it's all managed by United States Fish and Wildlife Service. That they get the money, they distribute it to the states based on the state's license sales. So the state has to generate money, and then they get 3-to-1 match for the money that they've generated. So that's kind of how conservation funding works in this country. There's a lot of effort to broaden the conservation funding base, and I'm supportive of all of it. I think it's important that we fund conservation. When land is lost, developed, it's forever. I mean, it's permanent. Yeah. You never get that back. We don't have a ton of wilderness in this country. I mean, there's not a lot of, you wouldn't know that standing here on your deck. You look out, it's like magnificent. Right. But when I look out and see that magnificent landscape, my thought is, we talked about earlier actually, is it'll always be that way. Like, that's the beauty of it.
That's the hope. Yeah. I really hope I don't ever look out and see construction. And I don't think I will, but you're right. It is.
Well, Aldo Leopold said it one time, and I don't remember the exact quote, but he's compared it to a vacant. He said, if you had a neighborhood and there are 5 vacant lots in that neighborhood, so you have this big neighborhood and there's 5 vacant lots, and those 5 vacant lots are where all of the kids come out to play baseball. Like, that's where they play stickball. That's their spot. Yeah. Well, maybe if you had to sell one of those to put a house on it, maybe that would be okay. Maybe if you had to sell another one, that would be okay. He said, but if you sold the 5th lot to build a house, then that's a tragedy. And that's kind of the way I think about this land protection effort. And a lot of times I say land protection, some people misread that as, that means you can't use it. Like, that's not what I'm suggesting. Right. What I'm suggesting, conservation, the definition of conservation is the wise use. Right. It's not non-use. It's not saying we can't go there, we can't hunt or fish or hike or backpack or bird watch, but we've got to be wise about how we use these resources. And when we develop them, when we pave them, when we destroy them, they're gone forever.
Right. And the kids and their kids can never use that.
That's right. And so there's the beauty aspect. One of the things, if your listeners do go into the Wild Harvest Initiative to look into it further, they'll recognize that we're talking about harvesting shed antlers, we're talking about harvesting plants, the foraging aspect. I mean, here in New Mexico, morel mushrooms are going to start popping in another couple of weeks, and that's one of my favorite things in the world to do, is go find wild morel mushrooms to eat. But so there's all the foraging stuff, but also the beauty of nature. And I see it, Glenn, on even your Facebook page. I mean, you'll post a picture of a fox or a picture of a bear or a picture of wildlife. Yeah. if someone goes on a hiking trip or, bicycle ride or something, and they see wildlife, most of the time when they come back and they're talking to their friends or their spouse or their family, oh, how was your day? The first thing they're going to talk about, oh, you're not going to believe this elk that I saw, or you're not going to believe this bald eagle. Like, we have a deep, deep connection as humans to the wild others. And in order for us to save that for future generations, it comes down to habitat. We've got to have places for those things to live. And when I look out here off of your deck at this unbelievable landscape, the view's amazing, and I'm harvesting the beauty of it, right? I'm harvesting that beauty, but I'm also just reveling in the amount of habitat that is being provided. There's just, it's massive and it's beautiful. And I really, it's rejuvenating for me to see that.
Yeah. And for the listeners and viewers, I often post on my Facebook page. I'll take little panorama videos off my deck because it's just it's super quiet, and the skies out here are different every single day, and the sunsets and the weather, and sometimes there's snow, sometimes there's rain, sometimes you can hear animals and things. But I post them under the heading of Moment of Zen. And you and I have had a lot of discussions, or we had a couple discussions about Moment of Zen, and to me, and really what I did is, it's a little bit of a joke, because at the end of the Daily Show, Jon Stewart used to always show the Moment of Zen, which was usually somebody getting hurt doing something dumb. He'd say, "Here's your moment of Zen." And so I started posting it because I'm like, it's kind of the opposite of that, but it kind of, to me, it tied together. But then you made a post about you were out duck hunting. Was it duck or geese? And you mentioned that to you, that was a moment of Zen, being there in the moment. And, and
that's right.
Seeing the flocks, start as the sun rose and the birds started to fly over. And the way you described it, and you had pictures to go along with it, but it absolutely hit the nail on the head. And because I'm in no way saying that the moment of Zen has to be just the peaceful, serene landscape. It's just any time you can feel that connection, and whether it's a connection to nature or a connection to yourself. Like, one of my absolute favorite Zen activities is splitting wood. And it's just because that, and the way I define my Zen activities is just things I can do where I can kind of just turn my brain off. And just really get in the moment. I used to do it fly fishing too. I used to fly fish before I moved away from New Mexico. Go fly fish the Guadalupe because I was working in Corrales, and it was easy to drive up there and fish till we couldn't see. And those are kind of very Zen activities, and so I think you don't have to. Moment of Zen could be someone falling off a skateboard, or but I think it's a little more impactful and meaningful if it's something that makes you deeply connected to your own heart rate, your own activity, or to nature, or to that animal. When you talked about, I think harvesting an elk is probably an incredibly Zen thing, because it's all about kind of becoming a part of that natural harmony and cycle, and
no, that's a great explanation, and I really appreciate that explanation, because I now remember. I forgot about that. I forgot about that waterfowl post, but now I remember. I know exactly where I was when I took that.
And where were you?
I was out near Tucumcari, actually. I was out near Tucumcari, and I was on a goose hunt, and it's really powerful because I leave Albuquerque for this particular goose hunt. I'm usually leaving Albuquerque or Edgewood about 2:00 in the morning. Okay. So I'm getting out there a couple of hours before first light, and it's super freezing cold. Like, that's the thing about waterfowl hunting. It's a wintertime activity generally. We're hunting in a dry field. This isn't hunting like a pond or a lake or a river. This is a field where the geese will come into land. This is actually on private land. Almost all of my hunting happens on public land, but this particular type of field hunting, you almost have to hunt an agricultural field, and farmers are a little more willing to give permission sometimes, because what happens, those geese will come, and let's say they planted a winter wheat or something, they're plucking those sprouts out. They're pulling out all those sprouts and really kind of damaging the crop. So having hunters on the field can help deter those wild geese from hurting the farmer's production of his crop. So sometimes you can get permission to hunt these private lands. But you get there, you're frozen cold. I mean, you're just like numb. Your hands, you can't feel them, because you're setting up decoys for hours in the dark with headlamps. And the ground's frozen, so you're pounding in stakes and setting up a huge spread, sometimes hundreds of goose decoys. And then you have this lay down blind. It's like a fabric thing that you cover with grass and hay and tumbleweeds and whatever your local vegetation is, because these waterfowl flying over, they'll notice any disturbance, anything out of place. So you've got to be super, super well hidden. So these are called layout blinds, and I'm laying down in this like covered blind that has a piece of mesh over my face and grasses and stuff all strapped to it with baling wire and all these kinds of things. And then you're calling, making goose calls and stuff, hoping that you're going to attract some of these flocks that are flying over. They're going to fly over, they're going to see your decoy spread, and then they usually start to circle. They usually circle like 3 times, looking at all of the decoys and looking at, making sure there's nothing out of place. This is a time when, as a hunter, you've got to be super still. Their eyesight is exceptional. Anything out of place, and they're going to, what we call, what's the term that we generally use anyway? They'll fly off. You can tell when they've noticed something they don't like. You can like watch their behavior, and so they'll take off. So anyway, you're trying to trick them, and you're using the calls to create the audio experience. The decoys are providing all of the visual, and then you have to try to disappear. But when it all works just right, it's a absolutely magnificent experience, because sometimes you're being circled by thousands, literally thousands of geese, and they're all communicating. They're all making their noises and their sounds, and you're hearing the wings beating. But when that's happening at the exact same moment that the sun's peeking over the horizon and you're frozen, but now you start to feel the warmth of the sun's rays, and it's like every sense in your entire body is getting completely heightened at the same time, because you're hearing these unbelievable geese. You're seeing the beautiful sunrise, and you're seeing the glint of the sun on the iridescent feathers of these birds, and just all of the stuff is coming together. And I mean, there's been so many times that we don't even shoot them, which I know that sounds crazy, but we're just laying there. And once you pop up out of the blind,
you spoil the moment.
Yeah, it's called flaring. Once you pop up, then their behavior changes instantly, and they try to get back airborne, and they're trying to get out of there. And of course, the goal of a goose hunt is that you pop up and you shoot some number of geese, and generally we can take 5 per day. Goose pastrami is one of my favorite foods in the world. I'll have to bring you some, Glenn. I'm very proud of my goose pastrami. But sometimes, like, that's so magical.
You don't want to spoil
it's so
it.
magnificent.
Yeah.
You just don't want to. You don't want it to end. You don't want to shoot them. You just want to watch them. You just want to experience them.
Well, in reading your description, and like I said, even though, and you even pointed out that it was a very different situation, but it reminded you of the moment of Zen, and I read that and I was like, he gets it. You really get it. That's like Zen, my concept, and I'm not speaking from a place of being any kind of a Buddhist or an expert in Zen, but just my vision, my feeling for Zen is exactly that. Is those moments where you can just really lose yourself, and what you're experiencing may vary, but you feel just very much connected to whatever it is you're doing or seeing, or both. And
yeah, the other. I was thinking about you when this happened too, because I think it was, I'm pretty sure back in October there was a big eclipse, and you had a party.
That's right.
You were having a party to watch this eclipse.
Yeah.
And I wanted to be at the party, but a friend of a friend had drawn a tag for bull elk in the Jemez Mountains, and these are brand new hunters, both of them. One of them had been hunting a couple times. The other friend, brand new. And so they'd contacted me and said, "Is there any way you could come help us on this elk hunt in the Jemez?" And yeah, I love helping people. I also love hunting elk, and so we put those two things together. And I rarely turn down an opportunity to go help someone on an elk hunt. So that's why I didn't make it to your eclipse viewing party, because I was up in the Jemez. But it was on a Saturday. That eclipse happened on a Saturday. It might have been October 14th.
That's right. It was October 14th. It was the annular eclipse.
Yeah.
Not quite as dramatic as the full, total eclipse, but still pretty awesome.
It was the most dramatic eclipse I've ever experienced in my life, because we're all there in camp, and that Saturday morning we make our hunt plan. We're going to go out. We're going to do this, and it was happening like sometime around lunch. It was like right around lunchtime. Or,
right.
I don't remember, 1 o'clock, something like that. Yeah. And so I'm with these 200. Well, one guy has a tag, and then his buddy, and so there's 3 of us. I'm like, man, let's go hunt elk. Let's get a good elk hunt in the morning, and in the middle of the day, we'll kind of take a break. Let's watch this eclipse.
Because you're still in the zone of totality.
Yeah, I mean,
which is brilliant.
We're there, so I'm like, we'll watch the eclipse, and it'll be amazing. And so we had a really awesome morning hunt, and then we're setting down to like get ready to have some lunch and kind of watch this eclipse. And then I hear this elk bugle, and I'm like, oh man, that guy's not that far away. And he has a bull elk tag. And so I'm telling my hunters, okay, let's get in position. Then another bugle. Then all of a sudden, I've never experienced anything like this in my life. It was like an out-of-body experience. The elk just went absolutely berserk. I mean, it was chaos. The cacophony of elk bugling and cow mewing and
just like all the
everywhere. Like it was, I've never experienced anything like it. And this lasted, I don't know, an hour, 45 minutes maybe. And then afterwards, and it was exhilarating. We didn't kill an elk the hunter harvested an elk later that evening, but we didn't kill an elk during that little window of time. When it was all said and done, we're like pouring in sweat. I mean, it was like, it was spiritual. I don't even know how to explain it. And then it occurred to me that we'd missed the eclipse. And so my Adrian was on hunt. He used to be the deputy director of the Wildlife Federation. He's now with the Nuestra Tierra Conservation Project, but he was my deputy director at the time. He was on the hunt with me. He was one of the 3 guys, and it was his friend who had the tag. And he says, dude, we got all sidetracked and we missed the eclipse. And it occurred to me at that moment, like I hadn't missed it. I didn't watch it.
You experienced it through
the elk. I experienced that eclipse completely by accident. But when I think back on that moment, it still gives me like the chills.
I'll tell you, Jesse, I think you made the right choice, because it was just a bunch of us up here at my house looking up with our eclipse glasses on. Like it wasn't, it was cool. You know, it was cool. Yeah. The temperature dropped like 15 degrees in a matter of minutes, and watching it was neat. And but that sounds like a much better experience.
It was just, I mean, it didn't even occur to me at the moment that it was the eclipse that was contributing to this behavior. Because October 14th is really the tail end of the elk rut. Like, breeding season for elk is like, it peaks 3rd week of September here. You know, it's really when it's in its full swing. There's still bugling and some activity going on into October like that, but this was something like I'd never experienced in my life. And I mean, there was no question in my mind that it was because of the eclipse. So we kind of missed the eclipse, but in a way had this.
You didn't. You experienced it, just not looking through eclipse glasses, staring at the sky.
Yeah,
which I think there's definitely an argument to be made that your experience was just as good, if not better. And I do need to make a little correction, because I said zone of totality. It's an annular eclipse. There is no zone of totality. It's like 90%.
Oh, okay.
But we were right in the middle of it here, and the Hamas was right in the middle of it, and.
It was just such a
that's where you get the perfect ring of the sun around.
Man, that was zen-like for sure. That was a zen-like moment, and I was so refreshed in my body and my soul and my mind, and you forget everything. It doesn't matter what problems are existing in your life at that moment in time. It's like it's just this incredible presence of the moment. This moment in time is so spectacular, and I wouldn't change a single thing about it. And when it ended, and the hunter was kind of frustrated. We had all these close encounters during this time, like tons of close encounters, but never a shot was fired. It just, the things didn't line up, and that's not, unusual in a hunting situation. But afterwards, like, oh my gosh, man, I can't believe we didn't get an elk after all of that, and we didn't even get one. I said, isn't that awesome? Like, that's even better, because now we get to keep hunting.
There you go. Yeah, and that's even better. Like, the positivity, find the good, and that's. Like, I think that's so cool. And how often do you get to experience a big scale event, like hearing all those elk, all the time that you spend in the woods? I'm sure you're not surprised as much as you once were,
right.
But that, probably was just
I've never seen anything like it.
Yeah.
I've never had an experience like that in my life, and might never again, because everything has to line up just right for that to work. I mean, the eclipse has to happen at the right time of year, I would think. Yep. I mean, elk probably didn't go crazy bugling on this last eclipse because it's not the rut. I mean, it's not breeding season, right? Maybe, I don't know, I wasn't out there, but I doubt it. Yeah. So the timing and the location, and then you got to be where the elk are, and I mean, all the stuff, there's a lot of things that have to line up to make that experience happen. And then the fact that it wasn't planned. Like, it wasn't like, hey, I have a good idea. The elk
Let's
might
go
go
try
crazy.
and hear the elk during the eclipse.
Exactly.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it makes it better. Like, to accidentally stumble upon a phenomenon like that is so cool.
It was that was an experience I'll never forget. But you know that zen-like feeling it's magical. You know, it really is magical. I can think of a place in the Aldo Leopold Wilderness where I like to go turkey hunting. I'll be there in a couple of weeks. Turkey season starts tomorrow, actually. I don't know when listeners are going to hear this, but April 15th is the start of turkey season in New Mexico. There's a place in the Aldo Leopold Wilderness where I backpack in, and I'm like 12 miles in deep, and there's this perfect crystal clear creek. And it's just a little narrow creek, 12 inches across in most places. You know, you can just step over it. But there's a couple places in particular where it forms these huge pools, these giant, beautiful pools that were filled with Gila trout after this last black fire a couple years ago. There's no Gila trout in there currently, but being deep in the wilderness like that and just stripping out of all of my hot, sweaty clothes and dropping my super heavy backpack and getting out of all that and then getting into that ice cold water on a sunny day and just laying in the stream bed. Wow. You know, submerged in snow melt in the middle of the wilderness. That's another place where it's like the meditation isn't a big enough word to describe that feeling, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's just like, you know, if you've worked really hard, you've been hiking all day, the food tastes that much better. Even if it's just like, you know, a store-bought hot dog. You know, like it tastes so good because you're just sweaty and tired and hungry. And,
yeah, exactly.
You know, and you're out in nature. And
yeah. That's the truth. I always appreciate those moments of zen. That's awesome.
Yeah, I just like I enjoy it, and I like to kind of it's kind of neat using social media. You know, there's a whole lot of different ways social media is being used these days, and I like to kind of focus more on spreading some positivity and adding some positivity to it. And I know a lot of people talk about how many people curate their social media feeds to only show the best of them, and I get that, and that's not really my intention. You know, my intention is more just add some positivity. Like let's you know, there's plenty of negativity, there's plenty of bad things in the world, but there's so much good, and really a lot of our whole attitudes and how we treat ourselves and each other just has to do with which one we're looking at, not how much of each one there is.
You should, on the next moment of zen, just for fun, in the description section at the top, say that if you don't copy and paste this on your wall, then you're going to have 10 years of bad luck.
You know what's funny about it is, first, I never make my stuff public, but I also I have a policy where I don't let people tell me what to do over social media. So like if you tell me that I need to share this, even if it's a really good sentiment about being a father or something, no, I'm not.
I share that with you. I'm the exact same way.
I'm like, no, you don't get to tell me what to do over social media. Even if it is kind of the right thing, I'm just not going to do it out of principle because I don't like that, you know, you have to do this or you'll get bad luck, or you know, or I know 5 of my friends will share this and that's how I'll know who my true friends are. I'm like, well, I guess I'm going to go ahead and self-select out. And if you unfriend me because I didn't share your thing that you shared from somebody else and originally from a computer somewhere, like it's not going to hurt my feelings. I understand. It's just Facebook. like we'll all be okay.
I share those sentiments exactly 100%. Like we are lockstep on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's plenty of impactful, important things to say, but say it in your own words. Like, you know, don't just be manipulated and then manipulate other people into saying it. That's kind of the opposite of what we should be doing.
Yeah, you know, one time I shouldn't say fell for it, but one time I participated in one of those things and I regretted it ever since, because even now I'll get a memory. I'll be like, you posted this thing 7 years ago.
Yeah.
It'll pop up in my memories. And it was a deal like a photo challenge. It was like,
I absolutely have participated in that.
I'm
not above
post a
reproach,
photo every day for the next 10 days of you hunting or something, or whatever, hunting photo every day for the next 10 days. And I participated in it, but then I had to every day select someone else to participate in it. And afterwards I felt kind of silly about it. Like
No, I've done those things, and I don't think they're all bad. I just think they're not for me.
Yeah,
I did the 22 push-ups a day thing for veteran suicide, because that's a real important cause to me. But I think the message kind of got lost by everybody focusing on thinking that it was dumb that everybody was doing push-ups on Facebook and then tagging friends to also do push-ups.
Right.
And it's like the intent is good, but then if the outcome isn't good, then it doesn't really help the
Sure,
issue.
sure.
At the time, I thought, well, this is a good way to bring this to people's, to get people's attention, and it'll get me a lot of push-ups. Because I did 22 push-ups a day for 22 days.
Yeah.
And every single day I tagged people, so I was that guy.
Yeah, right.
doing
right.
it. But now, flash forward a decade or more, I don't do that anymore. I don't participate.
Yeah, that's funny.
But I'm just trying to find other ways that maybe aren't part of some kind of viral trend or.
Yeah.
So.
Super cool.
Yeah. One thing I wanted to mention, because it's something that I've noticed in the time that I've known you, is your public facing anyway, your personality that you put out to the public strikes me as being very nonpartisan. And you talked a little bit about that, how the hunters were telling you, you're in bed with the enemy, and I don't know, how much you get from the other side as well, but I really appreciate that. And I think there's, for one thing, we're just so divided.
Yeah, we are.
And it's not getting better. And I kind of feel like a lot of it's for the wrong motivations or the wrong reasons. And really, like we were talking about with hunters and activists for wildlife conservation,
Mm-hmm.
they have more in common than they have differences. And I think that's true of most of our society. And most people, if you meet them and just have a conversation and one of those key topics doesn't come up,
Yeah.
you're going to get along just fine.
That's right.
And it's kind of sad that we live in a world where if some of those key topics come up, then that's it, end of discussion, and now I have to hate you. And I that bothers me. It troubles me a lot because, I think we need to figure out how to get along, or, at this point, I tell people, I'm like, well, my daughter and her generation needs to figure this stuff out, because I'm pretty sure my generation has done a lot of damage and isn't going to fix it.
Yeah.
But I do appreciate that about you, that I sense that you're very adept at talking to kind of everybody, and you have to be in your position. It makes sense. It totally makes sense that, you wouldn't go and show up just displaying one side of the political spectrum, expect to get anything done, because it seems like all you're going to do is make enemies. And
Yeah.
is that hard for you to navigate all that?
It was in the beginning. It took me a while to. I've never considered myself necessarily partisan. I don't have any loyalty to either political party.
Well, nor should you.
And I really don't like the two-party system. I think the two-party
totally
system
agree.
by design is divisive.
Oh, yeah.
I think I was in 5th grade when I, as a school project, came up with a new system of voting in this country as a 5th grader, for a school project.
Wow.
And basically the way it worked is there were no political parties, and I don't know that this is feasible, right? This is a 5th grader who came up with this, so just to be clear.
I think you lost all of Congress by saying the political party. It's like, all the lawmakers are like, we're out.
Yeah, we're out. Nope, not going to work. If it's not based on money, then how is this ever going to work? But the way it works, and just to make it simple, we'll just talk about, say, a presidential election. Let's say you have 5 candidates instead of 2. And you get to rank them, 5 being best, 1 being the worst. So now your vote counts no matter what. No matter who won, your vote was relevant. Your
That's
vote
interesting.
mattered,
Yeah.
because you gave the second candidate 4 points, and then 3 points, and then 2 points. Because the frustrating thing for me is that I find myself, when I go into a voting booth, frustrated because I want to vote out of principle, I want to vote for the best candidate. That's what I want to do. Who do I think is the best candidate for the job? That's who I want to vote for. But if it's not one of the 2 candidates that is a Democrat or a Republican, the chances of them winning are 0. And so you get told you're throwing your vote away.
Exactly, yes.
You get told you're just throwing your vote away. A vote for that person is a vote for this person, right? Like, and I understand that. I know what they're saying, but I feel like if I'm voting for someone that I don't think is who I want, I kind of feel like that's throwing my vote away. Yep. I don't want that person.
No, I totally
to be
agree, and I
my
also think it's a very flawed logic that, like, you're throwing your vote away. Well, you're only throwing your vote away until enough people have voted for that third candidate for it to make a difference, and then you're no longer throwing your vote away. And so, but they always leverage, this is too important, this is too big a deal, the stakes are too high, you can't vote for the third party or the fourth party or the fifth party. Like, you can't. Like, you have to lesser of two evils. And I think that's like, we've already discussed, I don't like being manipulated or bullied. And B, it's very, it puts you in a bad position. Like you have to then kind of cast aside your own values and say, okay, I guess if I got to pick one of the two, which the current situation is not looking great for that. It's like,
it's rough. But early on in this job, I was overly vocal about my frustrations with political parties and different things, and that got me into a little bit of trouble, and it took me a while to realize I'm accomplishing nothing by that. There's no benefit to it.
Yeah.
Where I need to be is strictly focused on the issue, and the reality is I have to work with whoever is in a position of power, elected or appointed. I don't care if you're a Republican, I don't care if you're a Democrat. If you're the governor, I'm gonna have to work with you.
Right.
And when I say work with you, what I'm really talking about is I'm going to have to praise you when you do things well and right. When you do the right thing, I'm going to be there to thank you for that. When you're making a bad decision or a decision that is not in line with the mission and values of the organization which I run, we're going to hold you accountable. Mm-hmm. And I don't care, what political party you are. I don't care whether you like donkeys or elephants or red or blue or none of that matters. This is the issue we're dealing with, and this is what the outcome we're looking for.
The beauty of that is it frees you up to do the right thing, both for yourself, but also for your organization.
Right.
Which I think is, I think that it absolutely makes sense. There's nothing about it I was like, man, that doesn't make sense. But I think it's interesting that other people might look at that and say, well, how come you're working with them?
Yeah.
And it's like, that's a very short-sighted vision of what's going on.
Right.
And
yeah, I mean, it's so interesting. Now, to interview my membership, and the New Mexico Wildlife Federation has an interesting membership model because it's free membership. So people don't have to pay to be a member. They just nmwildlife.org, they can sign up, join our organization, get the newsletters, all the stuff, be informed on all the issues. But it's not a paid membership, so I would venture to say there are a lot of members who disagree with certain things that we do or positions that we take. Like they recognize the benefit and value of staying informed on the issues, and we do a better job, I think, than most conservation organizations in the state on keeping people informed and up to date on important issues. So we have a lot of people there, but when I say members, it's not like they're all my fans of me, right? It's not my fan club necessarily. I take a lot of criticism from a lot of our members, and that's fine. I appreciate that. I want members to give feedback and call me up and send me emails and tell me what you think, good or bad. I need that. That's important for a leader of an organization to have that. But I would say half of the members in our organization think I'm way too progressive, and the other half think I'm way too conservative.
That's funny. Yeah, it's funny you mention that because Sally and my wife Sally and I talk about this a lot because depending on the conversation, I've had people accuse me of being both. And it's like it's a very interesting dynamic because it's just like, well, wow, that's previously I was in the military and I ran a firearms training company and so that to a lot of people automatically throws me over on the right. But then you start talking to me about other issues, and it's not that I waver on my views on Second Amendment rights or where I stand on that. It's just there's other things that I'm willing to be open-minded about that don't align with everybody else that's pro-Second Amendment. And so, then I get in a conversation and I'm talking about the wrong thing. And recently we were on a camping trip and somebody, we got into a discussion about spanking, and it's something I've never done. We've got a sample size of one daughter, and she's 13 as of a couple days ago, and she seems to be doing okay, but we've never spanked. And I put a lot of thought into it when she was a baby, which is kind of interesting, but I try to be as intentional as possible, and so does Sally. We're really on the same page about a lot of this stuff. But the more we thought about it, the more we talked about it, we decided spanking wasn't the right choice. And we decided that that's not the critical element to raising a good kid. And I'm not indicting anyone that uses corporal punishment, but that's just where we landed. And I'm very comfortable talking about it because I've put so much thought into it.
Yeah, sure.
Well, I got accused of being a liberal for saying that, and I was like, okay, that's interesting. And honestly, I am pretty liberal in a lot of my thinking, not in the political blue-red version of liberal, but just in terms of I try to be very open-minded.
Yeah.
As I think should everybody, but it ends up placing me in these positions where, if I meet one person and talk to them about something, I'm a staunch conservative, and if I meet somebody else and talk to them about a different topic, then I'm a liberal, and honestly, I refuse both of those titles.
Yeah, right. No, and I appreciate that so much, because I feel the same way. Secretary Pete Buttigieg was in town a year ago or so. From the Biden administration. He's Secretary of Transportation, United States Secretary. He's in town, and I had the opportunity to give him a tour of some areas in this state where I think it's very, very important that we build critical wildlife migration structures, actual crossing structures, underpasses, overpasses, reduce wildlife vehicle collisions, save lives of people, save money for motorists, save the lives of wildlife. I mean, in Colorado, as many deer die on the highways every year as are killed by hunters. Wow. So if we're thinking about hunting opportunity, imagine if we didn't kill all those deer on the highway. How much more opportunity is there for hunters and food procurement and putting food in people's freezers and Hunters for the Hungry and helping with food banks? And there's all kinds of benefits. But man, it was on social media, pictures of me with Secretary Buttigieg and all of these things, and the hate mail that came in, oh, I knew you were one of them Biden guys. Well, look, guys, he's the Secretary of Transportation. I'm working on these large-scale transportation infrastructure priorities. What do you think? Who would you like me to talk to about this, if not him? I mean, it's insane to me.
And when you have the opportunity to bend the ear of somebody in that position, regardless of their policy or politics, it'd be so short-sighted to stand on your ego and say ego and political stance or whatever, and say, no.
Exactly.
Like, I had a chance to help the wildlife of the state, but I would have had to work with that guy. Yeah. Like, that makes no sense. It doesn't pass the test of
You're
common
exactly
sense.
Right. So yeah, I really appreciate the open-mindedness and all of that, and what you said earlier about, like, if people just talk to one another and not have all these labels, and forget about all the preconceived opinions we have about each other based on the don't tread on me sticker or the whatever, the MAGA hat, whatever it is that people wear. If you don't see all that stuff and you just talk to someone at the gas pump next to you, people are generally interested in similar things. People generally want the same kind of thing. They want their kids to be successful. They want to be happy. They want to have a little bit of money. They want to do the things they enjoy. I mean, that's...
Well, and I think it's important to keep in mind, even the people that don't agree with one, it's usually from a place they're trying to do the right thing, even if they're if I think they're misguided, or if they are patently misguided, they're usually trying to do the right thing. Most people, criminals and sociopaths aside, most people, I think, are trying to do the right thing most days. And so if I view them from that perspective, it's easier to give a little grace and not feel like I need to hate him because I don't like his hat, or because I don't like whatever, I don't like the fact that they're out protesting, or it's like, I don't need to, and that's not really how this country was designed or has become, as it's grown. It's like the whole idea. I feel like over time we were getting better at not hating each other.
Yeah,
for a couple centuries.
When we were talking earlier about MCI, and I was talking about all the leadership training and things that MCI provided, and there was a lot of training by Stephen Covey, who's a great trainer. But one quote that he says that if people really put this into practice, it's transformational, I think, and that is seek first to understand and then to be understood.
So critical.
If everybody just does that and seek first to understand, and then after that, you can try to be understood, it changes everything. And, as you know, Glenn, you've been on my podcast before, and I've had a lot of different guests on my podcast. One of the most controversial ones I ever did was with Ryan Bussey, the author of the book Gunfight. And
I listened to that one. Yeah, it was very interesting.
He was the vice president of Kimber Firearms. So he came from the firearm industry, had a lot of criticism of the National Rifle Association. Ryan Bussey's currently running for governor in the state of Montana.
Oh, wow.
So he's a gubernatorial candidate right now, which is interesting for a guy that wrote a book kind of whistleblowing the NRA in a red state like Montana.
Right.
But I'm following his campaign because he's a close friend of mine, and I appreciate him. Don't agree with him on everything. I don't agree with anybody on everything, but I really, really appreciate him. But the amount of criticism I received for that and the amount of assumptions that were made about me because I had him on my podcast, it's like, well, I wanted to hear what he has to say, and I wanted to hear about this book, and I wanted to have the conversation. And, I'll have anybody. I want to learn about people.
I totally agree. It puts us in a scary place where we're not willing to hear. And it also, to me, it indicates, like, if you're not willing to hear an opposing viewpoint or something that makes you uncomfortable, then the ground you're standing on probably isn't all that solid. Like, are you really that insecure that you can't have a conversation and then step aside in a friendly manner or step away from the conversation, disagreeing on stuff, but still listening to each other? You know, it's so much better than shouting each other. That quote you gave didn't include shouting down. I noticed that. Like, at no point was there like, start to understand, then shout them down, and then force your viewpoint on them. That wasn't them.
It didn't work that way.
Before we get too far off track, because then we've been at this for 2 hours and 13 minutes.
Wow,
doesn't seem like that long, right? It does. And I knew having you as the first guest was going to be a easy way to come into the podcast, because I know you're good at this. You're really good at talking and conversing, and you're not new to podcasting. So, I can kind of look to you.
Yeah, well, you can always cut it down, edit it out, shrink it, break it into multiple episodes, whatever you want to do.
I don't plan on cutting anything down, except maybe the part where I got up to check if the camera was working. I think there's a lot of value in many parts of it, and different people are going to find value in other areas. And that's one of the great things about podcasts, is you're not stuck with a 3-minute television interview or even a 1-hour documentary or something. It's you basically can talk as long as you want. But I did want to ask before we kind of wrap things up, and I think you've kind of given a lot of this already, but what excites you right now? What are you looking forward to?
Boy. Are you talking about from a work perspective or a personal standpoint?
Yes. So what's just the thing that's like right now just kind of lighting you up and it could be work or personal, because one of the things is this. The whole drive of this podcast isn't just to talk to the director of the New Mexico Wildlife Federation.
Sure.
It's to talk to Jesse.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. Sometimes I forget that those are two different people.
Well, they're the same.
I know, but
there's you mentioned the public-facing Jesse, and then there's Jesse, and you don't have to get too personal or anything. I just, I want to, especially as I go through these episodes, I want to hear what people are excited about. Like what?
Yeah. I'm really motivated and thrilled to broaden my horizons of understanding the human species, right? I've traveled a lot in the United States, and I've been to Canada, I've been to Mexico. I've done a little bit of travel in my life, but this recent experience all across Eastern Europe really opened my eyes to how much of a echo chamber we kind of live in here in the United States, right? And I know you have military service. I never served in the military, so I didn't have all the travel that's associated sometimes with being a service member. But now, as I mentioned, my girlfriend's doing international travel, global travel all over the world, and she's consulting with me on designing specific trips. And there's one to Indonesia that we started talking about. Wow. There's one in South Africa that I'm really thinking strongly about pursuing. There's a number of these different places, but again, it's when I've traveled in the past, Glenn, it's been like a tourist. Mm-hmm. Go to the t-shirt shops that are catered to the Americans who are going to buy t-shirts and Chinese-made stuff to take back home for a.
Well, I'll tell you, if you want to have a harder time connecting with a culture, go there as the military. It can be a little challenging even in places that we're not actively engaged in combat. There was one of the places in northeastern Africa where I went a few times. I remember one particular town, we drove through it pretty much every time we went out to go to the shooting ranges to train. Uh-huh. And the people in the town clearly hated us. And so I'm not going to be able to have those conversations because out the gate, and there's lots of reasons why people all over the world don't like the American military, and I don't deny them that.
Sure.
But it's just like, so I don't, when traveling with the military, I didn't always get to experience, and that's why this sounds so, I can see why you'd be excited.
Yeah, it's just, it's so interesting. I was in Belize in December, and we were in the Coxcomb Basin National Wildlife Preserve, the only national wildlife preserve in the world that was formed for the preservation of jaguars.
Oh, wow.
And so I spent almost a week in there, 4 days, something like that, looking for a jaguar. My goal was to put eyes on a wild jaguar, which I never did. But the guide that I had, there's some areas in the Coxcomb Basin that you cannot go without a local guide. You have to hire a professional guide to take you in certain areas, just their laws.
Right.
And so a lot of it I did on my own, but where I couldn't access, I hired this local this Mayan man who was indigenous to the area.
Sure.
And he was my escort into some of these off limits areas or off limits to the do-it-yourselfer.
Yeah.
He's been guiding trips through the Coxcomb Basin for over 20 years, and in that time he's seen 4 jaguars in his life.
Okay, so it's no surprise you didn't see one.
No surprise I didn't see one, and I wasn't disappointed by it at all.
Right.
But I'm eating termites, and I'm living the jungle lifestyle, and I'm experiencing this local culture and local cuisine and all of these things. But we're talking about this preserve, this nature preserve for the jaguar. And he's telling me how controversial it was when it got formed, because people lived there. There were communities that existed in that jungle, and they all got moved out.
Wow.
Like the government came in and relocated them, said, we're making this a nature preserve, and there could be no development, there could be no people, we're gonna make it our own little wilderness. So simultaneously,
which is a tough pill to swallow if you're living there.
Yeah,
right?
and you have been for generations and generations, and they're saying, look, this area is critical jaguar habitat, this species is severely endangered and we need to protect it, so we're moving you all out of here, and we're going to create this preserve, and it's going to create income because tourists are going to come here and travel here, and they're going to go in here and they're going to pay people to guide them on these eco-tourism excursions, and all this stuff is going to happen, and all these people got completely dislodged and their lives impacted greatly, and it was very controversial, but they did it, and they created the basin. But then he told me when COVID happened and all tourism shut down, they almost lost the preserve, because all the people who had been displaced, now there's no income, now there's no tourism, now there's all the things they had been promised wasn't happening anymore, right? And so they were getting near almost like a hostile takeover of the land, coming back and taking it back, because it had been taken from them in their eyes, and I could see why, of course. But then luckily travel started happening again before it came to that, and tourists started coming back down. But there's still a lot of there's a lot of tension, there's a lot of distrust of the government in that region and from some of those people. But it's the exact same conversations I sometimes have with ranchers whose grandfather had a ranch on what's now White Sands Missile Range.
Right.
When Department of Defense decided we're going to create this White Sands Missile Range, there were ranchers and homes and homesteads and people living there. They said, gotta go.
Eminent domain.
Eminent domain. Here's your check.
Holy cow.
Get out of there. And so there's so many similarities from one part of the world to another, and it's the human condition that's consistent. Right. And it's so interesting to meet people with unique circumstances, but realize like how
we still have so much in common.
Exactly. There's so much there, and our similarities and the resilience of the human species and stuff. And so, I think that's probably what excites me the most is really learning more about this species to which I belong, I guess.
That is an excellent thing to be excited about. So on that note, I think we'll call it.
Awesome. Well, hey, thanks for having me, Glenn. I really appreciate it, man. This was a great time.
Oh, I'm sorry. Before we shut it down, where can people find your organization?
So if anyone's interested in finding me or learning more about the New Mexico Wildlife Federation, you can find us on Facebook, Instagram, all that stuff, or go to our website, NM, like New Mexico, nmwildlife.org, nmwildlife.org. You could sign up, receive the newsletter. I put a director's message in the front of every newsletter. I'm super easy to get a hold of. You could find me, Jesse Deubel, on Facebook or Instagram, just by my name, Jesse, no I, and Deubel is Deubel. Feel free to look me up and connect with me however works for you.
And your podcast?
Oh, the podcast that I host is the Ahi Va Podcast. That's spelled AHI, new word, VA. And I don't remember what episode you were on, Glenn, but anyone listening?
Well, it wasn't a good one. So
I like that.
It was the company.
Yeah.
Well, for starters, I was just kind of a bit player, but at the end of the day, that business didn't work out. So, and it wasn't my business. But
that was a fun. It was a
really fun episode. It was a fun discussion. Tyson Sanders was on it.
Yeah, and I think the Dennis Calloway wasn't Dennis on there.
Dennis was there.
I think the title of the episode was "The Power of Partnerships."
It was.
And it was a partnership conversation with the Founders Ranch, who's no longer in operation, but it was at Founders Ranch, and we were talking about all kinds of cool things with Department of Game and Fish and telling cool stories, and that's where I first met you.
Right.
So the fact that Founders Ranch isn't around anymore is unfortunate, but the fact that we got to meet each other
is a huge bonus.
Build a friendship, man, it's all worth it for sure.
All right, well, thank you so much for coming on, Jesse, being my first guest, episode 1.
Awesome.
And I don't know when it's going to come out because I need to do some editing and publishing, and I also may try and get a couple more in the bank before I start putting any out. So
cool.
I'll let you know when it comes out. So whenever you hear this, you're hearing it.
Sounds good.
It may be quite a bit after April 15th, but all right, for April.
Turkey season might be over. Yeah, even better. I'm not attracting everybody to my spots that way.
There you go. All right.